Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. It was just supposed to be a routine trip, a day out in the countryside to pick apples with my younger sister. We had heard about an orchard outside town that had been around for decades, with the kind of reputation that promised perfect fruit and peaceful afternoons. The kind of place where time slowed down, where you could forget everything for a few hours. We arrived early in the morning, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The orchard was beautiful, sprawling with apple trees so old they seemed to hold secrets in their gnarled branches. A single, weathered sign hung at the entrance, reading harvest time, take only what you can carry. It sounded simple enough, but something in its tone made me pause. The first few hours were idyllic. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light that danced across the ground. My sister laughed as she climbed higher to reach the ripest apples, her voice bright and carefree. I stood below, picking out the juiciest fruits and filling our basket. But then the humming started. It was faint at first, like a distant melody, but it grew louder as I glanced around. The orchard was silent save for the wind rustling the leaves, but the hum was unmistakable. I looked up at my sister, who had stopped moving and was looking over her shoulder, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. The humming was like a song, but with no words. It had an unnatural quality, a sweetness that was almost painful to listen to. I stepped closer to her, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Suddenly, a branch behind us snapped. We both jumped, looking around as the air grew colder. The trees that once seemed so inviting now felt like they were leaning in, like they were eavesdropping on our fear. My sister, still half in the tree, climbed down quickly, her eyes darting around. "Let's get out of here," I said. But she didn't move. She was staring at something beyond the rows of trees, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked, but before she could answer, the humming broke into a distinct voice, low and melodic. It didn't sound like any human voice I had ever heard. "I see you." The words didn't come from anywhere we could see. It was as if they were carried on the wind, but they were close, right behind us. I grabbed my sister's hand and pulled her toward the path leading out of the orchard, but the air seemed heavier now, pressing against us as though the forest didn't want us to leave. The trees on either side of us seemed to move, the branches twisting to create a corridor that funneled us deeper into the orchard. I heard a branch snap behind us, and I turned to see a dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was shifting, flickering like a broken video. It had eyes that glowed, hollow, with an intensity that made my blood run cold. We ran faster, my sister stumbling as I pulled her along. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it following, like the breath of something cold and unseen at our backs. When we finally burst out of the orchard and into the open fields, the sun was higher in the sky, and everything seemed normal again. The humming stopped, the oppressive feeling vanished, and the air felt warm as if nothing had happened. But, as we looked back, the orchard was empty, the trees still and unmoving. And then, just as I thought we were safe, I heard the voice again, this time from the edge of the woods. "I see you." My sister grabbed my arm, eyes wide with terror. The air was still, but in the silence, I could almost hear the trees whispering, shifting, preparing for the next time we dared to enter. I had never been a fan of summer fairs. The noise, the crowded booths, the unsettling clamor of carnival music playing out of tune, it all made me uneasy. But when my friend Lucas convinced me to go with him that Friday night, I couldn't say no. It was meant to be a simple escape, just a couple of hours spent in a crowded park with greasy food and cheap rides. It turned out to be anything but. The fairgrounds were a sprawling mess of flashing lights and laughter, the scent of fried dough mingling with the sharp tang of something metallic. Lucas and I wandered from one ride to another. The thrill of seeing the old attractions sparked childhood memories. But then we stumbled across an old fortune teller's tent, an out-of-place relic with a sign that said, "Find out what fate has in store for you." Before I could stop him, Lucas was already tugging me toward the entrance. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense, and dim, flickering candles cast jagged shadows along the walls. An old woman sat at the table, her back hunched and eyes like dark marbles that seemed to follow you wherever you went. "You are here for answers," she rasped, her voice thin and raspy. "But they come at a cost." Lucas glanced at me, a grin tugging at his lips. "We're just here for fun," he said, but I could tell there was something else in his eyes. A challenge, maybe, or a dare. I sat down next to him as the woman shuffled a deck of worn, tattered cards. Her hands, covered in rings that seemed older than the fair itself, moved with a practiced grace. She laid the cards out one by one, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I leaned forward, suddenly aware that we had wandered into something I couldn't control. She stopped on a card, her eyes narrowing. "Your fate is not yet written," she said, "but it will be tonight." Lucas scoffed, but I felt a chill trace the back of my neck. "All right, we're done here," I said, standing up. The woman's eyes locked with mine, and her mouth twitched into a smile. It was not the smile of someone who was joking. "You'll see," she whispered. The rest of the night was normal, or so I thought. We rode the Ferris wheel, ate cotton candy, and laughed as Lucas tried to win a stuffed bear at the ring toss. But then, when we were walking by the carousel, I heard the faint sound of music playing backward, like a record that had been scratched. I glanced at Lucas, who was staring ahead, his expression unreadable. Then the lights flickered. For a moment, the fair seemed to pause, holding its breath. A shiver ran down my spine as the carousel horses began to move on their own, their eyes wide and unnatural. The painted mouths twisted into silent screams. "Lucas," I whispered, but when I turned to look at him, he was gone. I ran through the fair, pushing past laughing families and confused carnival workers, but there was no sign of him. The world around me began to spin, as if I was caught in some kind of fever dream. The air grew colder, and the noise, the children's laughter, the distant shout of a carny died down, replaced by a thumping that grew louder, like something heavy dragging itself across the ground. I turned a corner and nearly stumbled into him. Lucas stood by the fortune teller's tent, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes that were not his own. The air around him crackled, a strange blue light radiating from his body. "It's time," he said, voice deep and unrecognizable. I reached out, but before I could touch him, he crumbled into dust, the light vanishing as if it had never been there. I stumbled backward, gasping, only to find myself alone, the carnival now lifeless and gray, the twisted remnants of the tent flapping in the wind. A whisper curled around me, slicing through the silence. "You were warned." I didn't know if I ran or if I was dragged away by the wind, but the next thing I knew, I was standing on the empty road leading back to town, my heart slamming against my ribs. The fair was gone, vanished like it never existed, and Lucas was gone too. All that remained was the taste of metal on my tongue and the memory of the cards. I never went back to the fairgrounds, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, telling me that fate can come for you whether you want it to or not. It was supposed to be a simple day trip to the old amusement park, long forgotten and left to the elements after the fire that shut it down years ago. My friends and I were always up for a bit of mischief and adventure. So when we heard the place was still standing, we decided to go check it out. The sun was high, the air crisp with a hint of autumn, and we felt invincible as we parked our car on the cracked pavement and stepped through the rusted gate. The park was a maze of half-collapsed rides and faded attractions, their colors peeling and names barely visible beneath layers of grime. We explored for hours, climbing into the derelict roller coaster, peering into the hollow eyes of animatronic animals in the old petting zoo, and laughing like kids again. The air carried a sense of nostalgia, tinged with something else, something heavy, that clung to our skin. As the sun began to set, a chill settled over the park. It was just past 6 p.m., and shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and bending with the wind. We were on the Ferris wheel when it happened. The creaking of the metal, once a reassuring sound of the ride, grew louder, sharper, as if the wheel was straining under some unseen weight. The laughter between us stopped abruptly as we looked out over the park, searching for what could be causing it. That's when I saw just a flicker at first, like a shadow dancing at the edge of my vision. I leaned over the railing to get a better look, but it was gone. I turned to my friends. trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Their faces mirrored my own apprehension, and I realized none of us wanted to be there as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first sound was a sharp, metal screech that split the silence. It came from the direction of the old fun house. We all exchanged glances, the air between us charged with a fear that no amount of bravado could dispel. Without a word, we slid out of the Ferris wheel seats and started walking toward the noise, our feet crunching on the gravel path. The fun house loomed ahead, its mirrors shattered and its entrance yawning like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. We stood in front of the broken doors, breath shallow, before stepping inside. The musty smell of mildew and decay surrounded us, and our flashlights cast jittery beams across warped reflections that seemed to twist and stretch as we passed. We turned a corner and saw a figure, half hidden in the shattered shards of a mirror. It was a person, or it had been. The glass had splintered through its face, leaving an expression frozen mid-scream. I gasped, stumbling backward. My friends backed away too, eyes wide, bodies tense as we stared at the broken remains. But then, behind us, came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the darkened hallway. "Go," someone whispered, and we sprinted out of the fun house, hearts pounding. The path to the exit was obscured by the deepening night, but we kept running, pushing past the amusement rides and dodging the rusted remains of bumper cars. We glanced behind us, but saw nothing, just the stretch of empty, moonlit pathways. But when we reached the old ticket booth, the front door creaked open, and out stepped a figure. It wasn't human. Its limbs were twisted, bent at impossible angles, as if the bones had been replaced with wire and shadows. Its face was a warped mask, half hidden beneath a hood that seemed to flicker like flame. Before we could scream, it was gone, vanished into the night with a movement too quick to follow. We stopped only when we were outside the gate, gasping and clinging to each other, as if the park itself were trying to pull us back in. The next day, I scoured the news for any mention of the park. There was nothing, not a word about strange occurrences or people going missing. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure at the ticket booth, eyes like hollow black pits, waiting for the next unwelcome visitors. The first time I noticed the smell, I was unpacking groceries in the kitchen. It was subtle at first, a faint, metallic tang that I couldn't place. I thought maybe the meat had gone off, but when I checked the refrigerator, everything was fine. It was late autumn, and the nights were growing colder. I just moved to this old farmhouse on the edge of town, looking for some solitude after a rough patch. The town had a charm to it, with its cobblestone streets and crumbling buildings. The house was the kind of place you'd see in old postcards, with creaking floors and walls that whispered when the wind blew. I let it slide, chalked it up to the draft coming in through the cracks. But that night, as I lay in bed, the smell returned stronger, sharper. I pressed my pillow over my nose, trying to block it out, but it was no use. It smelled like blood mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something sickly sweet. I sat up in bed, listening. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Just as I was about to dismiss it as paranoia, there was a noise. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the basement. I hesitated, my hand on the edge of the bed, frozen with fear and curiosity. The thumping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming up the basement stairs. My blood ran cold. The hallway was dark, only a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor from the window. I swallowed hard, heart thudding in my chest as the steps grew louder. I crept to the edge of the door, peering out into the gloom. Nothing, just silence. I reached for the lamp by my bedside, flicked it on, and the room was bathed in a weak, yellow light. It felt like a futile shield against whatever was in the house with me. The noise started again, this time coming from behind the closed basement door. I waited, breath shallow, ears straining to hear. A scraping sound followed by the creak of wood, then something wet and heavy dragging across the floor. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run into the night, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body locked in place. A sound like a whisper curled through the darkness, a voice I didn't recognize. "Why did you leave?" I took a shaky step forward, toward the door, just as it swung open by itself. The sight that met me stole the breath from my lungs. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was a figure, draped in tattered clothes, eyes hollow and wide. It looked like it had been waiting for a long time, and then I saw it, the blood. It smeared its way up the walls, pulling at the base of the stairs like it was alive. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, searching for an explanation. The figure tilted its head, and a smile stretched across its face, full of broken teeth. The smell became unbearable, sharp and metallic, searing my senses. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted for the front door. I didn't stop to look back, not even when the whisper came again, colder this time. "Don't leave me." The air outside bit into my skin, but it was better than the suffocating heat inside. I ran into the street, gasping for air, feeling the eyes of the house on my back as it loomed, ancient and silent. The townspeople found me hours later, huddled under a tree, muttering about what I had seen. They told me the house had been abandoned for decades, that no one lived there, that it was cursed, but I know better. I know it's still waiting. And now, every time I pass by the old farmhouse, I catch a whiff of that same, sickly sweet smell. I'm not sure if it's memory or if it's real, but it's there, always there. I was out for a late night stroll through the neighborhood, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The streets were empty, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the pavement. It was the kind of night that felt a little too still, the kind of night when you know something's off, but can't pinpoint what. I turned down a side street I hadn't walked down before. The houses here were older, with peeling paint and cracked shutters. The gardens were overgrown, wild ivy creeping up the walls like it was trying to pull the houses back into the ground. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension, but the quiet seemed inviting, so I pushed forward. I was about to turn back when I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from inside one of the houses. My first thought was that it was just a creaky floorboard or an old appliance, but then I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, repeating a single phrase over and over. "Help me, please." It's too late. My skin prickled. I glanced at the windows, but the curtains were drawn tight. I hesitated, torn between running and investigating. The voice was pleading, desperate. My instincts won out over my fear, and I found myself walking up to the front door, my knuckles white as I clenched them. The door creaked open when I pushed against it, as if inviting me inside. I stepped into the dark, the smell of mildew and something metallic filling my nose. The voice was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I tiptoed through the living room, every floorboard creaking beneath my feet. I didn't know why I was going toward the sound, but it was like I was being pulled by an unseen force. I reached the stairs and paused. The voice was coming from above, echoing down like a tortured plea. "Help me, it's too late." I swallowed hard and started up the steps, my heart pounding as the air grew colder with each step. The hallway at the top of the stairs was pitch black, but the voice led me to a room at the end. I pushed open the door and gasped. The room was empty except for a rocking chair, which was moving back and forth as if someone had just left it. The voice stopped suddenly, and a heavy silence fell over the room. I could feel the air pressing against me, thick and suffocating. Then I heard a sound like breathing, close and ragged. I spun around, but there was no one there. The chair stopped rocking. My blood ran cold as I felt a presence behind me, something sharp brushing against my neck. I turned quickly and saw a figure in the hallway, a shadow with eyes that glowed a deep, unnatural red. I stumbled back, hitting the wall with a thud. The shadow moved closer, its limbs stretching impossibly long, and then I realized what it was. It was me, or at least a version of me, eyes hollow and face twisted in a grotesque smile. "It's too late," it whispered, reaching out with fingers that were more like claws. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the chair, which had started rocking again, as if waiting for me to take a seat. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying in the grass with the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon. I stumbled to my feet and ran home, my mind reeling. I never spoke about what happened that night, but I'll never forget the look in those eyes, and every night since then, I hear that voice, echoing through the quiet streets. "Help me, please, it's too late." I've never been a superstitious person. Growing up, my friends would make fun of me for not believing in ghost stories, haunted houses, or any of that paranormal nonsense. But that summer, on the farm with my cousin and her family, everything changed. The farm was far away from the city, surrounded by miles of golden fields that swayed in the wind like an ocean of grain. The air was warm and smelled of freshly tilled soil and wild flowers. I thought it would be a perfect escape from the noise and chaos of my life. The first couple of days were idyllic: morning chores, afternoons playing in the fields, and long evenings sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It felt like the kind of summer I'd imagined when I was a kid. Then, one evening, things took a turn. We were sitting on the back porch, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples as the sun set behind the hills. My cousin, Maria, mentioned offhand that the old barn had been abandoned for years, ever since her great-grandfather had disappeared. I asked her what she meant, and she shrugged, a look of unease passing over her face. People say he went into the barn one night and never came out. Some say he's still there, waiting. I laughed, but it felt hollow. That night, after Maria and her family went to bed, I found myself staring out the window at the barn. It loomed in the distance, an ancient silhouette against the moonlit sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes. I don't know why I did it, but I found myself grabbing a flashlight and walking out into the dark. The fields seemed alive as the wind rushed past, the stalks whispering secrets that only they could understand. I crossed the yard, the wooden boards creaking under my feet as I approached the barn. The air grew colder, making my breath visible in short puffs. I hesitated at the door, fingers on the rusted latch. The barn had always seemed solid in the daylight, but now it looked like it might collapse at any second. I pushed the door open, and it groaned in protest, revealing a pitch-black interior. The flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting eerie shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. I shone the beam around, but the space was empty, save for broken tools and a dusty old cart. It was only when I turned my head that I saw it, the faint outline of a figure, standing in the corner. My heart clenched, and I backed up, tripping over a rotting board. The flashlight fell from my hand, and for a second, the barn was swallowed by darkness. I reached out blindly, fumbling for it. Just as my fingers closed around the cold metal, a voice whispered from the dark, "Leave." The hair on my arms stood on end, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. My pulse roared in my ears as I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door. Just before I could leave, I felt something cold brush past my neck, like a shadow moving against my skin. I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I saw a face pale and gaunt, with eyes that glimmered like shards of glass. I didn't stop running until I was safe inside the house, the front door locked behind me. I barely slept that night, the sound of my ragged breaths mingling with the distant creak of the barn door swinging in the wind. The next morning, Maria found me pale and jittery at the breakfast table. I told her I'd just been out for a walk, but she looked at me with knowing eyes. After breakfast, she led me to the old barn, the morning sun casting long shadows across the fields. "Whatever you saw, it was real," she whispered. "But you should know it's not just the barn that holds them. They watch from the fields too." I turned, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw dozens of figures watching me from the wheat, their faces pale and empty, eyes hollow with the same endless hunger. I never went back to the farm, and I never looked at an open field the same way again. It was supposed to be just a day trip, a last-minute plan to take my dog, Duke, for a hike in the hills behind my house. I'd been so caught up with work lately, barely having time to breathe, that this spontaneous adventure felt like the reset I needed. The air was crisp, and the early autumn leaves crunched underfoot as we made our way deeper into the forest. Duke was a big, happy mutt, bounding ahead as we walked. The trail narrowed, the trees arching over us and weaving together like they were trying to hold secrets. I laughed when Duke paused, his ears twitching. He was always so alert, but today, something seemed different. He glanced back at me, eyes wide and dark. "Come on, buddy. It's just the wind," I muttered, shaking off the unease. But when I turned back, I realized the air had grown still, suffocating even. The usual chirping of birds had stopped. The silence was oppressive, as if the whole world had paused just for us. A sharp snap, like a branch breaking, came from deeper in the woods. I stiffened, my skin crawling. Duke's hackles were raised, and he let out a low growl. I took a deep breath and whispered, "It's just a deer. Duke, relax." But my voice sounded too loud in the silence. We pushed forward, the trail barely visible now as the trees closed in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the tension. I pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. It was a text from my friend, Alex, asking how the hike was going. I was typing my response when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from behind me. Duke's growl deepened, a low rumble in his chest. I spun around, searching the gloom between the trees. There was nothing but shadows, nothing but that damn silence. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, chittering sound, like 1,000 tiny feet scrambling against bark. "Duke, let's go," I whispered, suddenly feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on me. I turned, starting back the way we came, but as I did, I caught sight of something, a figure standing still between the trees. Its limbs were too long, stretched in an unnatural way, and it watched us with eyes that reflected the sliver of light from above. Duke barked sharply and took off, charging down the trail as fast as his legs would carry him. I had no choice but to follow, my breath coming in ragged gasps as we ran. The path twisted and turned, the underbrush snagging at my clothes as I pushed through. I could feel it behind us, a whisper of movement and the chill of something unseen. My phone chimed again, and I grabbed it, nearly stumbling as I tried to see the screen. Alex had sent a second message, "Everything okay? You've been gone a while." Before I could respond, a deafening thud erupted from behind me, followed by a guttural screech that made my blood freeze. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something metallic. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and for just a moment, I saw it. The figure from before, only closer now. Its mouth twisted into a grin full of jagged teeth and hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. I felt an icy hand grip my spine as I stumbled forward. The trail ahead looked familiar, a sign of civilization just up the way, a park bench and the edge of a clearing. I pushed myself faster, tripping over roots and rocks as the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder. Just as I reached the clearing, I heard the voice call out, raspy and unnatural, from the shadows, "You can't leave." I didn't stop. I sprinted the last few feet, grabbing the bench and clambering up as I gasped for air. Duke, panting and wide-eyed, scrambled up beside me. When I looked back into the woods, there was nothing but the dark, swaying branches. The trail was silent again, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. The voice echoed in my mind, that phrase haunting me, "You can't leave." It was the last thing I heard before I turned and ran the rest of the way home, knowing that the forest behind me was watching, waiting, and that whatever had followed us out hadn't left. I had never been a fan of large gatherings, but when my cousin invited me to her annual summer party at the family vineyard, I couldn't say no. The sprawling estate sat atop a rolling hill, its vineyards glistening under the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of sweet grapes and dry earth, and the distant hum of cicadas added a layer of calm to the scene. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Laughter echoed from the patio where friends and family mingled, glasses clinking as they toasted. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging greetings and grabbing a glass of chilled white wine. As the sun began to set, golden light spilled across the rows of grapevines, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to reach for me. I wandered away from the main gathering, wanting a moment of solitude. The vineyard was beautiful at dusk, the sky streaked with hues of pink and purple. But as I walked deeper into the maze of vines, the air turned cooler, the buzz of the party fading behind me. I turned a corner and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was an old, rusted metal bench with ivy growing through its slats. I sat down, taking a deep breath as I watched the sky darken. It was then that I noticed a soft, rhythmic thudding sound coming from somewhere nearby. I stood up and looked around, trying to place the noise. It wasn't the wind, it was something much more deliberate. The thumping came again, louder now, from the direction of the old barn at the edge of the vineyard. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started toward it, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound as I walked. The barn was huge, with weathered wooden doors and broken shutters. I pushed one door open, just enough to peek inside. The dim light revealed dusty barrels, empty crates, and old farming tools. But it was what I heard next that made my blood run cold. A soft, wheezing laugh coming from deep within the shadows. "Hello." My voice trembled as I stepped further in. The laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Suddenly, the barn door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, as the latch clicked into place. I pounded on the wood, shouting for someone to help me. No answer. I reached into my pocket for my phone, only to find it dead, the screen dark and unresponsive. I turned back to the barn's interior, searching for a way out. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far end, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its head tilted to the side, and I caught a glimpse of its face pale, hollow-eyed, with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. Before I could scream, it moved. The sound of its uneven footsteps sent a jolt of terror through me as I backed away. The barn was suddenly filled with that same wheezing laugh, a sound so jarring I felt it reverberate through my bones. I grabbed a nearby pitchfork and held it out in front of me, the metal cold and trembling in my grip. I charged at the figure, swinging with all the strength I had. The pitchfork sliced through the air and met nothing but thin, cold mist. The figure dissolved before my eyes, leaving only the stench of rotting grapes and the sound of the party outside. The barn door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the night air, gasping. The vineyard was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked back at the barn, the window was dark, and I could swear I saw a pair of hollow eyes watching me from inside. I never spoke of it to anyone, but every year, when the summer party rolls around, I can't help but remember the night I heard that laugh and felt the icy touch of something that wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be a quick detour, a drive through the hills to cut down on the time it would take to reach my parents' house. The winding road was flanked by tall oaks, their branches tangled like the gnarled fingers of an ancient guardian. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, and the distant rumble of thunder promised rain. I was alone, and as the road twisted upward into a shadowed pass, I felt an unsettling chill pass through the car. The road was deserted, not even a stray cyclist or a farmer's pickup, just me and the thickening darkness. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed an old, rusted sign by the roadside, half hidden by overgrown vines. It said, "Welcome to Hollow's End." I frowned. I had never heard of this place. The path seemed to narrow as I continued, the forest pressing in like a dark curtain. The engine sputtered, but I convinced myself it was just the old car. I turned the key, and after a few stutters, the car roared back to life. Then I saw them, a group of children playing by the side of the road, barefoot, their clothes tattered, their laughter hollow and piercing. They moved like marionettes, limbs jerking in rhythm to a music only they could hear. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but I could see the glint of their eyes, wet and reflective. I should have kept driving, should have floored the pedal and never looked back. But curiosity, that same force that got me into this mess, kept me glued to the wheel. I slowed the car, rolling down the window just enough to hear, "Come play with us," one whispered, its voice high and trembling, almost childlike, but not quite. I swallowed, heart pounding in my chest. "I'm not here to play," I muttered, my voice barely audible. The children stopped moving as one, and the silence stretched between us like a taut rope. Their heads tilted in unison, as if inspecting a rare specimen. Then they spoke together, their voices blending into a chorus that sent ice coursing through my veins. "Everyone plays with us." A sudden, bone-shaking wind howled through the pass, slamming into the car and rattling the windows. I jerked backward, pressing my foot on the gas, but the car refused to respond. The children's laughter twisted into something guttural and inhuman. They scattered, not into the woods, but toward the road, forming a line that blocked my path. Their limbs bent in unnatural angles as they moved, their eyes wide and black as the night. "Leave," I screamed, panic clung at my chest. The car shuddered, and with a burst of metallic groaning, it roared back to life, surging forward. The road blurred past as I drove, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, expecting to see them in pursuit, but they were gone. Relief was short-lived. The rain began, first as a trickle, then a downpour so heavy I could barely see. I wiped the water from my eyes and looked up, and there it was, Hollow's End, a village that shouldn't have existed. It was a cluster of old, run-down houses with windows like hollow eyes, the streets slick and black under the storm. Smoke coiled from a chimney, though no lights flickered. No movement. It was as if the town were holding its breath. I was pulling into a driveway before I could stop myself. The front porch creaked under the weight of my steps as I knocked on the door. A woman opened it, her hair disheveled, her eyes sunken. "They've come for you," she said, stepping aside as if she'd been expecting me. The rain was gone now, and so was the wind, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I stumbled inside, but before I could speak, I saw them, hundreds of children, standing in the yard beyond the window. Their hollow eyes met mine, and they whispered as one, "Everyone plays with us." The woman looked at me and smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Welcome to Hollow's End. You'll never leave." It was meant to be an ordinary day, the kind of day where I'd be outside, under a sun so bright it almost felt like a spotlight. My friends and I had set off for a picnic at an old field that lay just beyond the town's edge. It was an open stretch of land, surrounded by dense woods, with wildflowers and grass that swayed under the breeze like waves on a calm sea. We were in high spirits, laughing, sharing snacks, and taking turns trying to fly a cheap kite we bought from the corner store. It was that easy, carefree kind of afternoon until I noticed the silence. At first, it felt refreshing. No rustling leaves, no birds chirping, just the low hum of the wind. Then, it became unsettling. The usual chatter of the field was missing, as though someone had pressed the mute button on nature itself. I looked around at my friends, hoping one of them would say something to break the tension. But they were staring into the trees, their faces pale. I followed their gaze and felt my stomach tighten. At the edge of the woods, barely visible through the thin line of trees, there was a figure. It stood there, unmoving. It was tall, much taller than any human, with limbs that seemed too long and thin, like they'd been stretched beyond reason. It didn't step forward. It just watched. "Hey, is that a scarecrow?" My friend Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But this was no scarecrow. Scarecrows don't move their head or twist their body slowly, like they're considering whether or not to come closer. I wanted to laugh it off, tell everyone it was probably a trick of the light, but the figure raised one long, crooked arm and pointed directly at us. It was a slow, deliberate movement that left my body frozen in place. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked. The others nodded, and we began packing up as quickly as we could. The whole time I could feel that gaze on my back, heavy and cold. As we started toward the road, the air grew colder. The warmth of the sun seemed to be sucked away by the woods behind us. I kept glancing back, the figure now moving, taking slow, deliberate steps forward, each movement making a subtle, wet sound like water dripping onto dry leaves. Then, without warning, I heard it, a high-pitched, inhuman screech that sent a shiver through my entire body. My friends screamed, and we ran, not looking back, until we reached the edge of the road, gasping for breath, hearts pounding like wild drums in our chests. We stood there, panting, the field now a patch of green that seemed impossibly far away. One of us dared to look back. The figure was there, at the edge of the woods, standing in the clearing where we'd just been, its head tilted as if examining us, eyes reflecting the midday sun like black, endless pools. The screech came again, this time louder, and it echoed down the road like a chorus of crows. I turned and we all bolted, running down the path toward town, the thud of our feet drowning out the sound behind us. Hours later, when we were back home, safe and sound, I kept thinking about the figure. It felt like it had followed us, even though I knew it hadn't, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that it had been there, watching me as I ran. It wasn't until the next morning, when the local paper reported that a farmer had found a long, deep trail of footprints in the field, leading from his barn to the woods and then disappearing. And then, at the bottom of the article, there was a single line that made my blood run cold. "No known animal fits the description of the prints found." And then I remembered the way the figure's limbs had moved, like it had been trying to reach out to me. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, sharing a story that still keeps me up at night. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't an extravagant place, but it was tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, far from civilization. Perfect for a group of friends looking to disconnect. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the air crisp with the scent of pine. We settled in, made ourselves comfortable, and as evening fell, we gathered around the fireplace. It felt perfect, but things began to feel off. At first, I thought it was the isolation or maybe the silence that surrounded the cabin, but it was more than that. It felt like we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. The house grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the sense of unease that gnawed at me. It wasn't long before I heard something faint, at first, like soft tapping at my window. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the trees brushing against the house. But then it came again, louder. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was knocking at my window. I lay there, paralyzed, heart pounding in my chest. The knocks grew faster, then stopped. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I turned on my side, trying to ignore it, willing myself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I heard the sounds again, but this time they weren't from the window. It was at the door, slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I sat up in bed, frozen, and listened. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it felt like it was coming from right outside my door. My heart raced. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time more insistent. "Let me in." I finally worked up the courage to peek through the crack in the door, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to the others. They were all still sound asleep when I woke up, so I kept my nerves to myself. But as we sat around the breakfast table, one of my friends, Laura, spoke up. "I heard something weird last night," she said, her voice shaky. Like, knocking at my window. It was like someone was outside. I thought I was just imagining it, but now I'm not sure. The others exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said much. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't the only one. Later that day, we decided to take a walk in the woods to clear our heads. We spent hours hiking, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the unnatural silence that seemed to follow us wherever we went. It wasn't normal. That evening, we sat around the fire again, trying to enjoy the night. But the strange feeling lingered, like an invisible presence watching us. When we went to bed, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept hearing things outside, the same tapping, the same whispering. It was like it was trying to get in. But what terrified me the most was when I heard someone whisper my name. It was clear as day. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed to the window. There was nothing there. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I couldn't explain it. I had to stay calm. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us spoke much, but there was an unspoken understanding. We were all on edge, and none of us wanted to stay another night. As we walked to the car, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I saw at the front door. It was wide open. We had all locked it the night before. I didn't wait to investigate. We piled into the car and drove off in a hurry. But, as we left the woods behind, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror, just for a second. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. I don't know who or what it was, but I'll never forget the feeling. It was like we were being followed, watched by something that wasn't quite human. After that weekend, I tried to forget it. I told myself it was all in my head, just a trick of the mind. But when I looked at the photos we took during the trip, I saw something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, standing at the cabin's doorway, was a shadowy figure, just out of focus, and it wasn't any of us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't human. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect and unwind. My friends and I were overdue for a weekend getaway. So, when we found a secluded cabin in the woods, we jumped at the opportunity. We arrived late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly what we'd hoped for: old, rustic, and off the beaten path. There was something charming about the creaky floors and the smell of pine in the air. We gathered around the fireplace, laughing and reminiscing, settling in for what promised to be a peaceful weekend. But that first night, something felt off. As the fire crackled, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with a strange rhythm. It wasn't the kind of wind that howls, it was like something was tapping on the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just branches brushing against the wood. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, like a soft tap on the front door. I glanced at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. The knock came again, this time louder, followed by a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't just the wind. The knocking had a deliberate, almost human quality to it. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one responded immediately. So I stood up and walked to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard nothing but the wind outside, howling against the trees. I slowly backed away, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The night passed in a strange haze. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, hearing the occasional knock on the door and the unsettling scraping sound. But when I checked again, no one was outside. The cabin was still. The next morning, I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and we were all exhausted. But when we stepped outside to explore the woods, I noticed something strange: footprints in the snow leading toward the cabin, fresh and deep. They weren't from any of us. They circled the cabin before fading into the trees. I didn't say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods felt too quiet, like the trees were watching us, waiting. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the outdoors. But that night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just beyond the window. I quietly got up, careful not to wake the others, and peeked outside. Nothing, just the snow-covered ground and the trees, swaying in the wind. But then I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It didn't seem to belong to anything. The figure moved with unnatural grace, its silhouette stretching across the snow. I stared for a moment, trying to make sense of it. But when I blinked, it was gone. I bolted back to my bed, my heart racing. I lay there, wide awake, listening, and then I heard the knock. Soft at first, then harder, followed by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was ragged, almost distorted. I didn't know who it was or what it wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed still, too terrified to move, listening as the knocking came again, louder this time, right against the door. It didn't stop. Not until morning. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They thought I was just spooked, maybe imagining things, but they agreed to leave early. As we packed up the car, I noticed something else. The footprints from the day before weren't just around the cabin, they were leading toward the woods, and they were fresh, but they didn't look like human footprints. They were too large, too deep, and there was something wrong about them. They circled around the cabin, but then, right by the door, there were more marks. Scratches, gouges in the wood, like something had been clawing at it from the outside. We didn't wait around to investigate. We left, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, the wind completely absent. We never went back, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that wanted in. What I didn't realize until later was that the knocking wasn't the scariest part. It was the voice, the one that whispered, "Let me in." Because when I went back through the photos we took that weekend, I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, just outside the window, there's a figure standing in the trees, and it's smiling. Just a few friends heading into the woods for a weekend of hiking, campfires, and stargazing. We had chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, far from the usual tourist trails. The kind of place you only find if you're looking for it, and where the only sounds are the wind and the birds. We arrived just before dusk, the air thick with the scent of pine. It was beautiful, calm, and entirely untouched. We set up camp near a clearing. There was a small creek running through it, its water dark and swift. We didn't think much of it at first. We were laughing, unpacking, and excited to get the fire going. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees around us. After a while, we noticed something strange. The woods, which had been so quiet earlier, seemed to quiet now. The usual sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, had vanished. It was unsettling, the way the night felt so unnaturally still. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. But my friends noticed it too, and the unease grew. We huddled closer to the fire, exchanging nervous jokes to try and lighten the mood. But no one really felt like laughing anymore. That's when we heard the first noise. It came from deeper in the woods, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, deliberate and slow. It was too regular, too rhythmic, as though something was pacing around the perimeter of our camp. We froze, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but this didn't feel like the movement of any creature we knew. The noise stopped, and for a few moments, all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and our own breaths. Then, a voice. It was faint but distinct, just on the edge of hearing, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. Leave. The word was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear. We all looked at each other, our faces pale under the flickering light. None of us had spoken. It wasn't one of us. One of my friends, the most practical among us, grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "I'll check it out," he said, trying to sound brave. But his voice was shaking, and we all knew he was scared. We followed him, though none of us wanted to. We walked to the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thick and dark. The beam of the flashlight swept over the forest floor, catching only shadows and the occasional glint of something reflective eyes. Maybe, but we couldn't be sure. The air felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on us. Then, the flashlight flickered and died. Panic set in immediately. We all pulled out our phones, but of course, there was no signal. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole. I wanted to turn back, but something kept me frozen. The silence returned. Then came the whisper again, clearer this time, as if it was directly behind us. "Leave." Now, we spun around, our hearts racing, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just the night. We didn't stay long after that. We packed up quickly, more frantic than I'd ever seen any of us. The hike back to the car was silent, the eerie feeling of being watched never leaving us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made our hearts skip a beat. We didn't stop until we reached the car, where we drove straight back to civilization. We didn't talk about it much afterward. None of us really wanted to. We told ourselves it had just been our imaginations running wild, that it was all just nerves and the dark playing tricks on us. But I know what I heard. A week later, I received a message from one of my friends. It was a picture, a blurry image of a tree. But in the corner, barely visible, was a figure, tall, shadowy shape, standing in the same spot where we'd heard the whispering. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the figure in the photo was facing the camera, and in the place where its face should have been, there was nothing, just empty space. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard it a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. Is that a person? Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. What was that thing? He gasped. I don't know, but we should pack up and leave, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. The fire, he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. What the hell? Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. Get away from the fire, I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story I'd heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them, figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. The sun dipped below the horizon as I set up camp with my friends in a secluded area deep in the woods. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months, eager to escape our busy lives for a weekend of hiking and storytelling around the campfire. My friends, Mia, Jake, and Sam, arrived as twilight settled in. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. As darkness fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. Laughter echoed through the trees, drowning out the sounds of the wilderness. But, as the firelight flickered, shadows danced along the edges of our clearing, creating an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I brushed it off, attributing my nerves to the stories we were telling. After a while, Mia suggested we explore a nearby trail that wound deeper into the woods. She joked that it would be spooky, which made Jake laugh. Ignoring the gnawing feeling in my stomach, I agreed. After all, we were here for adventure. Armed with flashlights, we set off into the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the thickening night. The deeper we walked, the quieter the forest became. I could feel the tension in the air, and soon, even the crickets fell silent. A strange unease settled over us. I caught Jake glancing nervously into the trees, and Sam kept turning around as if expecting something to follow us. Just when I thought about suggesting we head back, a sudden clatter broke the stillness, a loud crash that echoed through the trees. sending a chill down my spine. What was that? Mia whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before I could respond, we heard another noise like chains rattling, echoing from somewhere up ahead. We froze, our flashlights illuminating only a small radius of the oppressive darkness. I felt my heart race, pounding in my ears. We exchanged anxious glances, each of us too afraid to speak. Then, I noticed a faint light glowing through the trees ahead, flickering like lanterns. Curiosity mixed with fear compelled us to move closer. As we crept through the underbrush, the sounds grew louder. The clanking of chains and the flickering light became increasingly unnerving. Finally, we reached a clearing, and what we saw will haunt me forever. A group of figures stood in a circle, their backs turned toward us. Each wore tattered clothing and held a lantern that swung slowly in the night. The light illuminated their faces pale and obscured by dirt and grime. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed they were bound in chains, shackled at the wrists and ankles. They swayed slightly, as if caught in a trance, their movements synchronized in an unsettling rhythm. I wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed me. I looked at my friends, their faces reflecting my horror. The group seemed oblivious to our presence, lost in whatever ritual they were performing. I felt a primal urge to run, but I was frozen in place, captivated by the macabre scene unfolding before us. Just as I began to step back, one of the figures turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. The mask covering its face was crude, painted with dark streaks that looked like tears. I felt a chill wash over me, and instinct kicked in. We turned to flee, sprinting back the way we came, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The sounds of clanking chains followed us, echoing through the trees. We burst into our campsite, panting and terrified. The fire had died down to embers, casting ghostly shadows around us. We gathered our things, adrenaline still pumping through our bodies. The chilling memory of what we had seen was etched in my mind. But, as we packed in a frenzy, I spotted something on the ground near the fire pit. I knelt down and touched it. It was a rusted chain link, heavy and cold. My heart sank, panic surged through us, and we raced to the car, hearts pounding, desperate to leave the suffocating forest behind. As we drove away, the trees began to blur, the darkness swallowing us whole. I thought we were safe until a flicker of light caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There, in the shadows of the woods, I saw the figures standing still, holding their lanterns, watching us leave. Their haunting presence lingered in the night, a reminder that whatever we had encountered would forever remain in the depths of those woods. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A few friends, a campsite in the woods, and the kind of quiet that can only come from being far off the beaten path. We thought we were prepared. Tents, a campfire, enough food for 2 days, and a cooler full of cold drinks. But I'll never forget how quickly that peace shattered. It started with the walk to the site. We arrived late in the afternoon, and there was something off about the air. It was thick, almost suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. It was just the wilderness, right? Nature doing its thing. But the closer we got to our spot, the more the trees seemed to close in on us. The path grew narrower, and the shadows grew deeper. By the time we set up camp, the sun was barely a sliver in the sky. I'd heard the stories about strange things happening in the woods, voices on the wind, lights flickering in the distance, but I was skeptical. I was determined to have a good time, not let the usual campfire tales spook me. We set up the tents, lit the fire, and joked around. I figured it'd be the perfect escape, but then came the first odd thing. Around dusk, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing there, watching. At first, I thought it was a person who had wandered off the trail, maybe another camper. But there was something wrong about how still they were. No shifting of weight, no fidgeting, just watching. I pointed it out to my friends, but when they turned to look, it was gone. I laughed it off. My friends did too. It was probably an animal or a trick of the light. But then, as the fire crackled and the darkness deepened, I noticed something else: soft, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking just outside the camp. Again, I told myself it was nothing. But the footsteps continued. They circled the camp, first to the left, then to the right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of a breath, shallow and quick, like someone was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friend Sam whispered, "Did you hear that?" We all heard it. Soft voices, too faint to make out, were carried on the breeze. They didn't sound like words, more like whispers, but the tone was unmistakable, a low murmur, as if a group of people was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, talking in a language none of us understood. That's when we decided it was time to go. We started packing up our things, but as I turned to grab the cooler, I saw something that made my heart stop. A handprint on the outside of the tent, smeared, like something had been pressing against it. But we had all been standing inside the tent the entire time. No one had touched it. We stared at it for a long time, the fire crackling in the silence between us. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispers were getting louder, more insistent. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the trees. A figure, crouched low, weaving through the trunks. It was too fast, too fluid to be a person, too wrong. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My legs were frozen. That's when the first true jump scare hit. A loud bang, like something heavy being thrown against our tent. The entire structure shook, and the fire flickered, casting distorted shadows across the ground. We all stumbled back, our breaths ragged, and that's when we saw an unmistakable trail of blood, starting from the edge of the camp and leading toward the woods. It wasn't animal blood. It was too dark, too thick. We ran. There was no hesitation. We grabbed what we could, threw it in the truck, and sped off, hearts hammering in our chests. When we finally got home, we thought it was over. But a few days later, as I was unpacking my bag, I found something in my jacket pocket, a small, torn scrap of fabric, dark red, stained with something that looked like dirt. But the strangest part, the fabric was exactly like the material of the tents we had set up that weekend. I stared at it for what felt like hours. My thoughts scrambled. Had something been with us in the woods? Something that we didn't see? Had it been in our tent the entire time? I didn't want to think about it, but the more I tried to push the thought away, the clearer it became. The whispers, the figure in the trees, the handprint, the blood trail, and that piece of fabric, something that definitely wasn't ours. We never went back to those woods. But I still wonder, what was it that we didn't see? What was circling our camp? Watching us, following us, whatever it was, it didn't let us go. A few friends and I packed our tents, sleeping bags, and a few essentials, and hiked deep into a forest that was far from any well-traveled trails. The sun was just beginning to dip below the trees when we set up camp in a clearing. The air smelled of fresh pine, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves filled the space around us. As we got the fire going, everything felt right. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where worries disappeared. By nightfall, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting. The forest felt alive with the sounds of night creatures, but there was an eerie stillness in the air, like something was watching us. I brushed it off as nothing more than my imagination, but I wasn't the only one who noticed it. My friend Sarah was staring into the woods, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, half joking. She shook her head. "I don't know. It just feels strange." I laughed it off. "It's just the forest. You're fine." We all tried to brush it off, but none of us felt entirely at ease. As the fire burned low, we decided to call it a night and crawl into our tents. I was the last one to settle in, zip my tent shut, and lie down, trying to push the nagging feeling away. It wasn't long before I heard the first noise. It was faint, like something brushing against the canvas of my tent. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. The wind. Probably, but then it came again, this time louder. Something was scraping along the side of my tent. I gripped the flashlight by my side, trying not to make a sound. I knew we weren't in bear country, and the thought of a person outside my tent sent a cold shiver down my spine. The noise came again. It was deliberate, slow, not an animal. My breath caught in my throat as the sound of something footsteps crunched in the leaves just outside. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The rustling got closer, right by my head. Then there was a whisper. "Don't open the door." I felt my heart skip a beat. The voice was clear, as if someone was standing right outside. It wasn't one of my friends. I knew that. I reached for the zipper of my tent, my hand trembling, and pulled it open just enough to slip the flashlight through. Nothing. The clearing was empty. I stared out into the darkness, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was no one. I felt like I was losing my mind. "Sarah," I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. "You okay?" The voice answered, distant but loud enough to hear. "Don't open the door, please." I froze, feeling my blood run cold. That wasn't Sarah. That wasn't anyone I knew. I reached for my phone. Dead. I couldn't even text anyone. Panic gripped me as the voice came again. This time it was more insistent, urgent. "You're not alone." I unzipped the tent all the way this time and stepped out, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, shadows flickering in the light. My pulse was racing, and I was on edge, every noise amplifying in my ears. Suddenly, a figure darted across the firelight. I snapped the beam of the flashlight in that direction. Nothing, just the wind, or it be a raccoon. I turned back to the fire pit, where my friends were still sleeping soundly. I wanted to wake them, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it. My mind screamed at me to wake them up, but I stayed frozen. Something wasn't right. I could feel the oppressive weight of something just beyond the trees. I sat back down on the log, trying to calm myself. Then, a loud crack split the night air. It came from behind me, and I whipped around, shining the light in that direction. There, standing just beyond the ring of firelight, was a tall, thin figure. My breath caught in my throat, my hand shaking as I lifted the flashlight. But when I looked again, it was gone. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the unmistakable outline of something in the darkness. It wasn't moving, but it was watching us. I backed toward the tent, every muscle tense. The figure remained where it was, standing perfectly still, just outside the firelight. I rushed into the tent and zipped it up, feeling the cold sweat on my neck. The voice came again, softer this time, almost like a whisper in the wind. "You should have left when you had the chance." We packed up in a hurry the next morning, our nerves shattered. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing. Weeks later, I went through the pictures on my camera. There was one I didn't remember taking a blurry shot of the forest, with what looked like a figure standing far behind the trees. But what made my skin crawl was the face I could barely make out in the dark. The face wasn't human. It was watching me. I've always worked late shifts at the old city library. The building is massive, a maze of bookshelves and reading nooks, half-lit and musty. I loved it. It was quiet, save for the sound of the pages turning and the occasional hiss of the old, creaky radiator. But it wasn't until the winter storm hit that I discovered how easily something could hide within the shadows. That night, I was the only one there. The wind whistled through the cracked panes of glass, and the lights flickered sporadically. I pushed the thought of getting stuck inside the library out of my mind. I had a shift to finish. The snow piled up against the doors like an impenetrable wall, and I couldn't hear the city at all anymore. It felt like the whole world had gone silent. I stood up from the desk and stretched, looking over the vast sea of books. I made my way down the aisle of history, past the stacks of dusty volumes and the occasional antique globe. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. Just rows upon rows of books, their spines blanketed in darkness. I pushed it aside and continued. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I stopped by the reference section, leaning against the oak desk. I swiped my phone out of habit. No signal. Of course. The library was a black hole for reception. The sudden jolt of the lights cutting out made me jump. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold breath at the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I stumbled back, eyes searching for a source of the chill. The emergency lights came on, casting a blood-orange glow that made the old, dusty books appear as if they were bleeding. I shivered and tried to steady my breathing, but something didn't feel right. The silence returned, deeper and more suffocating. I swallowed hard, daring to move toward the staff room to check the circuit box. I was halfway across the room when I heard a sharp, wet slap behind me. I spun around, eyes going wide as they locked onto the source, a book, lying open on the floor. its pages moving as if stirred by some invisible hand. The pages whispered, the sound more like a breathing than a breeze. I crept closer, the soft crackling of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The book was open to a page I didn't recognize, a drawing in the margin of a hollow-eyed face with a grotesque grin. The lines seemed to shift as I stared. The eyes blinked, then looked straight at me. The distant creak of a chair moving in the staff room pulled my attention. I took a shaky breath, clutching the book to my chest, and turned to find the door ajar, a deep, unnatural shadow spilling out into the hallway. The scent of damp earth and something rotting reached me as I inched forward. I didn't remember leaving it open. The room was empty, but I noticed the far window, cracked and icy, was now wide open. The wind howled, pulling the pages of nearby books like they were alive. And then I heard a sound like a quiet giggle, sharp and full of malice. My pulse quickened, my skin crawling. In the dim light, I noticed it, a figure just inside the dark, its head too large for its shoulders, grinning wide, eyes empty but fixed on me. I backed up, the book slipping from my hands as I stumbled over my feet. It hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then it lunged. The next moment was a blur. I was out of the library and into the biting wind, not daring to look back, the giggle still ringing in my ears. The snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I ran, faster than I ever had before. When I finally reached the street, the library's lights were out, completely dark. No more orange glow, no more whispers, just the cold and the oppressive silence. The next day, when I went back to retrieve my things, the library was exactly as I had left it, the book lying open on the floor, the page with the face now blank. They never believed me. The others said I was just tired, imagining things. But every time I passed the library, I glanced at the window where I saw it watching me. And I swear it's still there, waiting. The old amusement park had been closed for years, a skeletal reminder of better times. I never thought I'd visit it, but when my friend suggested sneaking in for a midnight adventure, I couldn't say no. We slipped through a hole in the rusted chain-link fence, the moon casting eerie shadows over the empty rides. The air smelled of damp earth and metal, like a place that had been forgotten by time. The Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its seat swaying slightly in the breeze. I could almost hear children's laughter carried away on the wind. My friend Jesse, ever the brave one, dared me to climb into one of the seats. I laughed, but I did it. The iron was cold under my fingertips, the paint flaking away as I climbed. As I settled into the seat, I noticed the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in a forest or an abandoned house. This was heavier, like the park itself was holding its breath. Then I heard a faint, mechanical whirring. The Ferris wheel shuddered as if an unseen force was trying to turn it. I looked around. Everyone was still on the ground, staring up at me. "Hey, stop messing around," Jesse shouted, his voice echoing. I raised my hand, a grin playing at the edges of my lips. But before I could answer, the seat jerked forward. My heart stopped as the wheel began moving, creaking and groaning. I reached for the safety bar, but it snapped shut on its own, trapping me in place. Panic clawed at me. The night seemed darker as I was lifted higher and higher. Below, my friends screamed, but their voices grew distant, swallowed by the relentless noise of the wheel turning. My pulse pounded as the wind picked up, ruffling my hair and tugging at my jacket. I could see the top of the roller coaster track, its rusted loops like skeletons frozen in time. And then I saw a shadow darting between the rides, moving too fast for the eye to follow. It was human in shape but stretched and warped, limbs bending at unnatural angles. "Help?" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the wind. The Ferris wheel reached the peak, and I realized it had stopped moving. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as I stared out at the park below me. The shadow paused, just under the carousel, its head tilted, eyes black and hollow, as if looking directly at me. The air crackled, sharp with electric tension. Suddenly, the carousel sprang to life. The horses spun wildly, their painted eyes glinting in the moonlight, and a low, grinding music began to play. The shadow moved again, closer this time, the edges of its form blurring as it approached the wheel. I was trapped, helpless, as the wind surged and the ride started moving faster. I clung to the seat, eyes wide with terror as the shadow reached the base of the Ferris wheel, feet skimming the ground. Then it jumped. Time slowed as it soared up, arms outstretched, its form twisting midair. I saw its face, a face like a broken mask with an impossible grin, eyes wide and gleaming with malice. The wheel snapped to a halt, throwing me forward. Everything blurred as I fell, and then there was only darkness. When I woke up, I was on the ground. The park was silent again, too silent. My friends were staring at me, their eyes wide and afraid. "Are you okay?" Jesse whispered. He helped me up, but something was wrong. My chest felt cold, hollow, like the air inside was slipping through me. "I think so," I said, but I couldn't stop shivering. And then I looked down. My shadow wasn't mine. It stood behind me, twisted and smiling, and I knew the amusement park wasn't empty. I've always been the skeptic in the group. Ghosts, monsters, all that stuff, never bought into it. But what happened to me that weekend changed everything. I still can't explain it. A few friends and I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The kind of place you'd see in horror movies. Old, isolated, with trees crowding in all around. When we got there, the place was exactly as advertised: quiet, remote, perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. We unpacked, cracked open some beers, and spent the night swapping stories and playing cards. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, unnaturally quiet. No sounds of animals. No rustling of leaves, just silence. I didn't say anything at first. I chalked it up to being out in the middle of nowhere. But it felt off. That night, as we settled into our rooms, things started to get weird. I was in the downstairs bedroom, one of those with a single window that looked out into the woods. The others were upstairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a normal feeling of being watched. It was as if something was waiting for me. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud bang. It sounded like something hit the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The wind was howling outside, but it wasn't that, it was something else. Then came the soft scratching sound, like nails on the wood. It came from just outside my window. I lay there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I could call someone, but the screen was blank. No signal. I had to check. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, my heart racing. I peeked outside, but all I could see was darkness. No movement, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. I was about to turn away when I saw a shadow, just at the edge of the trees. It didn't move like a person, more like a cloud shifting unnaturally in the night. My stomach dropped. I quickly pulled away from the window and ran back to the bed, locking the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my friends. I figured it was just a bad night, and maybe they'd think I was overreacting. But then one of them, Sam, mentioned something strange. I don't know, but last night, I thought I heard something tapping on my window, he said, looking around at us. I thought it was a branch at first, but it sounded like someone knocking. My blood ran cold. I wasn't the only one. That afternoon, we all decided to hike to the nearby creek to clear our heads. It was a peaceful walk, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was following us. Every time I turned around, the woods seemed to close in a little more. I told myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling stayed with me. We returned to the cabin later that day, and things felt off. The air felt thick, like we were being watched. We were sitting in the living room when we heard the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. We all froze. Sam stood up, walking to the door. "It's probably just an animal," he said, but his voice was shaky. He opened the door. No one was there, but that wasn't the worst part. The door had been left ajar when we arrived. But now, the door was slightly pushed open. It was as if something or someone had been waiting for us to leave the room before making its move. We didn't stay much longer after that. We packed our things and left as quickly as we could. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that I thought to check my phone. Still no signal. But the real kicker came when I saw the pictures I'd taken earlier of the cabin. One of the photos was blurry, taken from the window of my room. In the background, just barely visible, was a face. A face peeking out from behind a tree, grinning, with eyes that didn't look human. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that was waiting for us to leave so it could follow us. It's still out there. And I'm not sure if it's ever really going to leave. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm: worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again, gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from just beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there, nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, a little unsure of myself. "Hear what?" They replied, clearly distracted by the game. "I swear I heard something upstairs," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, the door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps, no sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." "I heard it, it's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier. While I was still in my room, it said simply, "You're not alone." It started as a normal evening. I was visiting an old friend who had recently moved into a big, creaky house on the edge of a dense forest. The place had a charm to it, but it also felt far too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. My friend had invited a few of us over to help unpack, and by the time the sun sank, we were gathered in the living room surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, laughing and joking over pizza and drinks. The house had its quirks. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the plumbing let out strange, hollow knocks. We brushed it off at first. It was an old house after all, and old houses have personality. That's what my friend kept saying. As the night went on, we decided to explore the house more thoroughly. None of us had seen the attic yet, and in a house this old, the attic felt like a guaranteed treasure trove of weird history. The door to the attic was in the upstairs hallway, hidden behind an old pull-down ladder. The ladder creaked under our weight as we climbed up one by one. The air changed as soon as we stepped into the attic. It was colder, and the smell was heavier, like old wood and mildew. The attic was full of dusty boxes, cobweb-covered furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. It looked like no one had touched the place in decades. We were rummaging through the boxes when we found something odd. It was an old photo album, but the photos inside weren't ordinary. They were black and white and showed a family, but their faces were strangely blurred. It wasn't from age or damage. It looked deliberate, as though someone had smeared their faces out before the pictures were taken. There were captions written in neat handwriting beneath each photo, but the ink had bled and run, making the words unreadable. That was when we heard it. A low, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere beneath us. At first, we thought it might be pipes again, but the sound was too deliberate. It was slow, steady, like someone knocking lightly on a wooden door. We stopped and stared at each other, unsure of what to do. My friend shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house settling, but the rest of us weren't convinced. The tapping stopped, but something else caught my attention. In the far corner of the attic, there was a mirror leaning against the wall, its surface grimy and cracked. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but I stepped closer. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The reflection didn't match what I was seeing. Behind me, I could see my friends standing in the attic, but in the mirror, they weren't moving. They stood frozen, their faces blank and staring directly at me. My stomach dropped, I turned around, and my friends were exactly as they should have been, laughing nervously and trying to decide whether to leave. I looked back at the mirror, and now the reflection was normal. I told myself my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to head back downstairs. As we climbed down the ladder, I was the last one to leave the attic. Just as I reached the bottom, I felt a cold hand brush against my ankle. I jumped, nearly falling, and turned to look. There was nothing there. My friends laughed nervously at my reaction, but I could see in their eyes that they were spooked to. Back in the living room, we tried to distract ourselves with more jokes and stories, but the unease lingered. That's when the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as we fumbled for our phones and flashlights. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the staircase. The beam of my flashlight caught the stairs, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There was a figure standing halfway down, its face pale and featureless, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, watching us, or at least I think it was watching. We froze, not daring to breathe. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked back up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't stay to investigate. We grabbed our things and bolted out of the house. not stopping until we were outside in the safety of the night air. My friend moved out a week later after finding scratches on the attic walls and hearing whispers at night. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I don't want to. All I know is that when I look in mirrors now, I can't help but wonder if the reflection I'm seeing is really mine. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and my friends getting away from the chaos of everyday life. We had all agreed on a remote camping spot deep in the woods, a place that was far from any hiking trails and even farther from the nearest ranger station. It was meant to be the perfect escape. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky. The trees here were dense, the canopy thick enough to block out much of the light. We set up camp quickly, unpacking our gear and starting a fire as dusk settled in. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, and for a while, everything felt normal. We joked and laughed, swapping stories and trying to ignore the growing sense of isolation the deep woods seemed to encourage. But as night fully descended, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No animals, no rustling of leaves, no distant sounds of water, just an unnatural stillness. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just the remoteness of the area, that everything would be fine. Then we heard it. A low, deep thud, almost like something heavy dropping to the ground. It came from the woods. Beyond the firelight, we all froze. My stomach twisted as I scanned the dark line of trees, unable to see anything through the thick underbrush. It's probably an animal, one of my friends suggested, but his voice trembled. I couldn't argue with him. It had to be an animal, right? We tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, another thud, this time louder, closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at my friends, but they were just as tense as I was. Maybe we should check it out, one of them suggested, though he clearly wasn't as eager as his words implied. We all stared at the trees, now far darker than before. Something about it didn't feel right. We decided to investigate, against our better judgment. With flashlights in hand, we stepped into the woods, the beam cutting through the dark, our steps cautious. The air was unnervingly still, the only sounds the crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots. Then it happened. From behind a thick cluster of trees, something shot out at us, a flash of motion, quick and too fast to be anything natural. We screamed and scattered, the beam of my flashlight flickering wildly as I turned in every direction, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything but shadows. Did you see that? Someone shouted. I don't know. I stammered, panic bubbling up inside me. My breath came in short gasps, my mind racing. We huddled together, trying to calm ourselves, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, a figure, but not like any animal, too tall, too thin. It seemed to vanish as soon as the light hit it. We headed back to camp quickly, our hearts still pounding in our chests. Once there, we all stayed silent, the fire crackling louder than it should. We avoided looking at each other, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the unease sinking deeper into our bones. Then, the noise came again. This time it wasn't a thud. It was a soft scraping sound, like something or someone dragging across the ground. My stomach lurched. It came from the trees again, but closer. Too close. We all jumped to our feet, shining our flashlights toward the noise, but nothing. The woods were silent once more. That's when it hit me, there was something wrong. We weren't alone. Suddenly, the bushes near the edge of our camp rustled violently. I jumped back, my flashlight flicking erratically as I spun to face it. The noise came again, closer, as if something was right there, just beyond the reach of the light. My heart raced in my chest as I backed away, but I didn't want to be the first to run. We stood frozen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. No movement, no sound, just a heavy silence that pressed down on us. I was about to call out when the ground under my feet shifted. I stumbled back, my flashlight cutting across the ground just in time to catch something strange, a mark. A large, wide indent in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the earth. That's when I realized the true horror. It wasn't just one thing in the woods. It was everywhere. I turned, eyes wide, and scanned the trees again. And that's when I saw it, glowing eyes, set deep in the shadows. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. We didn't wait. We packed up everything in a frenzy. my hands shaking as I tossed things into my backpack. We rushed to the car, not even pausing to check if anything was following us. The entire drive home, none of us spoke. We couldn't explain what had happened, but we all felt it. Whatever was out there in the woods, watching us, had been waiting for something, and we had gotten too close. We'd been planning this camping trip for months. A weekend getaway to disconnect, to get away from the noise and distractions of the world. Me and my 3 friends Jake, Ellie, and Tom had spent days picking the perfect spot in the woods, far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but not so far that we'd be completely cut off if anything went wrong. We arrived in the early evening, setting up camp near a small creek that ran through the area. The sun dipped behind the trees as we worked, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air smelled fresh, crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt peaceful, idyllic even. That night, we sat around the campfire, eating, joking, and telling stories. It was the kind of atmosphere where you felt safe, surrounded by friends and the flickering warmth of the fire. But then things began to feel off. It started with Ellie. She was sitting closest to the tree line, her back to the forest, when she suddenly froze. At first, we thought she was just being dramatic, messing around like she always did. But then she looked at us, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard something," she said, her voice shaky. We all stopped talking, listening intently. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Jake stood up, shaking his head. "Ellie, there's nothing out there. It's just the wind, or an animal. Don't freak yourself out." But Ellie wasn't convinced. She insisted she heard something movement, like footsteps, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We all stared into the darkness beyond the clearing, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves she was just letting her imagination run wild. But, as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift more than usual, and the air felt heavier, like something was watching us. The woods around us seemed unnaturally still, and the night seemed to stretch on much longer than it should have. At some point, we decided to head to our tents. We doused the fire, the embers glowing faintly in the night. We settled into our sleeping bags, but none of us could sleep. The sounds of the forest had taken on a strange quality, like they were distorted, just out of sync. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig, felt amplified, as though the woods themselves were breathing. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A loud bang, like something large crashing into a tree. It was so sudden, so sharp, that we all jolted upright in our tents. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. Tom was the first to grab a flashlight. He crawled out of his tent cautiously, shining the beam toward the woods. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark, empty trees. But then the beam caught something, a figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. A person? No, not quite. The figure was too still, too unnaturally rigid. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in our direction. We froze. None of us dared to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift its weight. It just watched. "Who the hell is that?" Jake hissed, barely above a whisper. We had no idea. We hadn't seen anyone else on the hike-in. No campers, no sign of anyone else around. But there it was, standing like a mannequin in the trees, its head slightly tilted, its limbs unnaturally straight. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I was about to call the ranger station when the figure moved. Slowly, it turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. "Get inside the tents now," I yelled, grabbing Ellie by the arm and pulling her toward her tent. We scrambled, hearts pounding, breath shallow. The flashlight had flickered out, casting the camp back into darkness. We could hear the figure moving closer, the rustling of branches, the slow scrape of something dragging across the ground. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, like a body hitting the ground. Then silence. We waited for what felt like hours, too scared to move, our minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But after a long while, we heard footsteps retreating, disappearing into the woods. One by one, we mustered the courage to step outside, the fear still heavy in our chests. When we checked the area where the figure had stood, we found something strange. It wasn't human at all. It was a mannequin, but not a normal one. This one had its face carved out, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin, and on the back of its neck, there was something scrawled in faded red letters. I see you. We ran back to our cars in the morning, barely stopping to pack up. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching us. And then, as we passed the last turn before the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the mannequin Dot, still watching. It was late summer when my friends and I decided to go camping in the woods just outside our town. There were 4 of us, me, Jenna, Mark, and Lucas. We had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, eager to escape our daily routines and enjoy nature. Little did we know that our weekend would take a turn we'd never forget. We set up camp near a beautiful lake surrounded by tall pine trees. The first night was perfect warm weather, clear skies, and a roaring campfire where we shared stories and laughed late into the night. As we sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet the woods were. I expected the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but instead, there was an unsettling stillness. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I could hear the wind whispering through the trees, but there was something else, a low murmur that seemed to echo through the darkness. It was faint, but it felt as if it was calling to me. I dismissed it as my imagination and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I told the others about the strange sounds. Jenna laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark. But, as we hiked during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees loomed overhead, and every now and then, I thought I saw a shadow dart between them. That night, the air felt different. It was heavy and charged, as if a storm were brewing. We made another fire, but it didn't provide the same warmth as the night before. As we roasted hot dogs, I caught sight of something in the woods just out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure, tall and cloaked, standing still among the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. Did you see that? I asked the others, my voice shaky. What? Mark replied, looking around. See what? Nothing. Forget it, I said, trying to brush it off, but I could tell my unease was spreading to them. We finished dinner quickly and decided to play some card games to lighten the mood. As the night wore on, I felt more and more restless. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost like voices. I suggested we go for a walk, hoping to clear my mind. Jenna and Lucas agreed. While Mark stayed back to tend the fire, we wandered along the lake's edge, the moonlight illuminating the water like silver. That's when we heard a clear voice coming from the trees. It was calling my name, softly, almost sweetly. My heart raced, and I glanced at Jenna and Lucas. They heard it too. Did you hear that? Jenna whispered, her face pale. We looked at each other, fear creeping in. The voice was beckoning me deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward, entranced. Don't, Lucas shouted, grabbing my arm. We need to go back. The urgency in his voice broke the spell. We turned and hurried back to the campsite, adrenaline pumping. The whispers faded as we approached the fire, and the sense of safety returned, but the unease lingered. That night, we slept fitfully, the shadows outside our tents moving with the wind. When dawn broke, we packed our things in silence, each of us feeling the weight of the night's events. As we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. We all laughed nervously, but deep down, we knew we'd experienced something inexplicable. The woods had held secrets that night, whispers that would haunt my dreams, reminding me that not everything in nature is friendly. As a park ranger, I had grown accustomed to the eerie stillness of the woods. It was mid-October, and the vibrant autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Most visitors had left, leaving the park in a haunting solitude that felt almost alive. I was patrolling the area when I received a call over the radio. A family had reported hearing strange noises outside their tent, something that sounded large and menacing. I set out on foot, a flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The night air was thick with tension, and the shadows loomed ominously among the trees. The path to the campsite felt longer than usual, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The family had set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the main trails. As I approached, I noticed an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath, When I reached their campsite, the tension in the air became palpable. The tent was unzipped but empty, their belongings strewn about haphazardly. My gut twisted as I called out for them. No response. I stepped inside the tent, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Everything appeared untouched, but the unsettling absence of the family gnawed at me. I heard it then, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back outside, scanning the perimeter. My heart raced as I noticed fresh claw marks on the ground, deep and jagged, surrounding the tent. I cursed under my breath, my instinct screaming that something was very wrong. I should have turned back then, but my ranger training kicked in. I had to find them. I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out for the family. The growl reverberated through the trees again, closer this time. It was guttural, a sound that belonged to something primal. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, its movement too swift for a human. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a tall, lanky silhouette with glowing eyes. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the darkness swallowing my light. I turned and ran, branches scratching at my arms as I darted through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, its growl morphing into a harsh cackle that pierced the night. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, desperate to escape whatever hunted me. Finally, I burst onto a familiar trail, breathless and disoriented. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup, my voice a frantic whisper in the static. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but fear clawed at my insides. As I waited, I could hear the rustling in the bushes, that low growl echoing closer. I turned, prepared to face whatever came next. Moments later, another ranger arrived, flashlight beaming into the dark. Relief washed over me, but I quickly warned him of the creature. We gathered our courage and approached the family's campsite, but the creature was gone. The only signs of disturbance were the deep claw marks and the ransacked tent. Then we heard its screams coming from deeper in the woods. My stomach twisted as we sprinted toward the sound, hearts pounding. What if we were too late? As we reached a clearing, we saw the family huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The relief was overwhelming until I turned to see what they were pointing at. In the center of the clearing stood the creature, its long limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. But then I realized something horrifying. The creature was mimicking the father's voice. "Help me," it called, but the tone was twisted, dripping with malice. It wasn't just a monster. It was a horrifying imitation, feeding on their fear. In that moment, everything clicked. The growls were not of a beast, but of a being capable of deception. It fed on the fear of its prey, luring them into the darkness. We backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs on it, the family still frozen in shock. My heart raced as I realized our only chance was to leave this clearing. We moved together, inching backward until we were out of its reach. The creature screeched in frustration, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed the family's arms, urging them to run. The woods felt alive with danger as we raced back to safety, knowing we had escaped a fate worse than we could imagine. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back at the dark woods, knowing the true horror had only just begun. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, but the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods, but one October evening still stands out in my mind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. I was assigned the late shift, my radio crackling softly as I moved through the trails, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. It was a typical night until I received a call from a couple camping in a secluded area about 10 miles into the woods. They reported hearing strange noises, a mix of growls and whispers that sent shivers down their spines. I tried to calm them, assuring them it was likely just a nearby animal, but their fear was palpable. I told them I would head their way and check things out. The hike to their campsite was uneventful at first, the familiar sounds of the forest filling my ears. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds faded, and an unnatural silence enveloped me. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, hoping to coax it back to life. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I quickened my pace. When I finally reached the couple's campsite, the sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. Their tent stood in disarray, the zipper partially open, and belongings scattered around as if a storm had swept through. But the couple was nowhere to be found. I called out their names, but only silence answered. My instincts kicked in, and I moved cautiously, scanning the area. As I walked further into the woods, I stumbled upon a trail of what looked like deep, claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. My heart raced as I followed the marks, trying to piece together what had happened. Each claw mark seemed to lead deeper into the shadows, beckoning me forward. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping to find the couple or at least something that would explain their disappearance. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart raced as I followed the movement, adrenaline surging through me. I stumbled upon a small clearing where I saw a figure standing with its back to me. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. My instinct screamed for me to run, but curiosity held me in place. I called out softly, asking if they were okay, but the figure remained motionless. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a cautious step closer. Just as I was about to reach out, the figure turned. My stomach dropped as I caught sight of its face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back in shock, and the figure opened its mouth to let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned to flee, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted back the way I came. Behind me, the figure's scream echoed through the trees, a haunting sound that filled the air. I could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping branches as it pursued me, but I didn't dare look back. I finally burst through the tree line and into the clearing where the couple's tent still stood. Panting, I skidded to a stop, turning to face the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The growling returned, echoing through the trees, and I prepared for whatever might come. Just then, the couple emerged from the woods, their faces pale with fear. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, and I couldn't help but feel relief wash over me. They told me they had wandered off looking for firewood and had gotten lost, but as I looked back into the forest, I noticed something chilling. The figure I had seen was standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching us with those same hollow eyes. I grabbed the couple and we hiked back to the ranger station, glancing over our shoulders, convinced that whatever had followed us was still lurking in the shadows. We made it safely back, but as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let something dark escape the woods that night, a presence that was no longer confined to the deep trees. I always thought being a park ranger would be a peaceful job. I spent my days hiking the trails, keeping an eye on the wildlife, and sharing my love for the outdoors with visitors. But that all changed one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped up my last patrol and headed back to the ranger station. The woods took on a different feel after dark, and even though I was alone, I felt a strange sense of unease. I locked up the station and decided to take a short walk before heading home. There was something about the silence that drew me in. I wandered deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing between the trees. The familiar paths felt different in the dark, and every crack of a twig made my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, a low, grating sound. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the forest. It sounded almost like someone whispering, but there was a raspy edge to it. I shivered, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Continuing my walk, I stumbled upon an old camping site. The fire pit was cold, the logs arranged haphazardly. I remembered this spot. It was a popular camping area for families. I pulled out my radio, ready to check in with the other rangers, when I noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the site, but they were mixed with something else, something that looked like claw marks. My heart began to pound as I knelt to inspect them. The prints were large, almost too big to belong to any animal in the area. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I heard it again, the grating whispering. It was closer this time. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the path, the light bouncing erratically in front of me. Just as I rounded a corner, my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand. extinguishing the only source of light. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. In the darkness, the whispers became louder, almost mocking. I finally managed to get it working again and aimed the beam into the trees. I was greeted by a horrifying sight. Standing just outside the circle of light was a figure. Tall and thin, with long, gangly limbs, it stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to my feet and ran. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, echoing all around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I raced down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, panting heavily. After a few moments, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was just tired from my long day. I flipped the light on and checked my radio. Just as I was about to call it a night, a chilling sound broke through the silence. A soft knock echoed from the door. My heart raced as I approached, hesitantly peering through the window. Outside stood a family, mom, dad, and 2 kids, looking lost and frightened. They explained they had been camping nearby when they heard strange sounds and saw a figure in the woods. They had fled, thinking they would find help. My body relaxed, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. I welcomed them in and made them comfortable while I called for assistance. They described the whispers and the figure, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I turned to grab some extra blankets, I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it again. The tall, thin figure was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. The trees were alive with movement, and all around the figure were dozens of those same twisted silhouettes, all staring in silence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't crazy. The whispers hadn't been in my head. The forest had been hiding something much darker all along. The family beside me had unwittingly stumbled into something I had barely escaped, and now it felt like it was closing in. The night was deeper than usual, the kind of darkness that feels like it has weight. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights in the woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring campers were safe. But this evening felt different. A chill ran through the air, making my skin prickle. The trees loomed above me like ancient giants, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes against the moonlight. Earlier in the day, a family had set up camp near the lake. They were a cheerful group, chatting and laughing as they roasted marshmallows. I'd stopped to make sure they were aware of the park's safety rules, especially about keeping food secure from wildlife. Little did I know that this simple encounter would haunt me. As darkness enveloped the forest, I began my usual rounds. The sounds of the woods were all too familiar: the rustling leaves, the distant hoots of owls, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. But then, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. A woman's scream echoed through the trees. It was raw and desperate, cutting through the tranquil night like a knife. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the lake, the screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made my stomach drop. The family's campfire still flickered in the distance, but their voices were gone. I reached their campsite, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the area, searching for any sign of them. The tent stood undisturbed, but the air felt wrong. I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Panic set in as I turned to check the trail leading away from the lake. That's when I saw a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to catch a clear glimpse. My instinct screamed for me to run, but I had a duty to protect these campers. I had to find them. I moved cautiously along the path, my flashlight illuminating the foliage as I pushed deeper into the woods. The darkness felt alive, closing in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting. Just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing. There, at the center, was a large figure crouched low, its back to me. I froze, my breath hitching. The figure was wearing something that resembled a tattered shirt, and I could see matted hair hanging down its back. My mind raced with horror stories of what could lurk in the depths of the forest. I stepped back slowly, but the sound of my movement caught its attention. The figure turned, and my blood ran cold. Its face was grotesque, a twisted mockery of a human. Eyes wide and bulging, it opened its mouth in a silent scream. A wave of terror washed over me, and I turned to flee. I sprinted back toward the camp, adrenaline pushing me forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, something lurking just out of sight. When I reached the campsite, I found the family emerging from the woods, faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked as if they had seen a ghost. I rushed to them, relief flooding through me. But before I could ask if they were okay, the mother spoke, her voice trembling. She said they had heard whispers in the trees, voices calling to them in the dark. Then, before I could process what she was saying, I caught a glimpse of the figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. I turned to the family, urging them to pack their things quickly. We needed to leave. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, but the signal was weak and crackling. Just as the family hastily packed their gear, I felt a sudden, icy breath on my neck. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the dark. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered like a heavy fog. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and the force seemed to whisper around us. We managed to get everything packed, and I led them away from the lake, my heart racing. I kept glancing back, half expecting the figure to reappear. When we reached the main road, I finally exhaled, the tension slowly lifting. But as I turned to reassure the family, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They were smiling, their eyes unblinking and vacant. They weren't scared at all. In fact, they seemed utterly calm, as if nothing had happened. My heart raced again, but for a different reason. I stepped back, confusion taking over. They weren't the same people I had spoken to earlier. The woman tilted her head, her grin widening, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come looking for us." The forest felt alive around me, pulsing with something dark and sinister. I stumbled backward, realizing that the woods had claimed them as its own. As I turned to run, the laughter of the family echoed behind me, a haunting reminder of what had happened in those deep woods. It was supposed to be an easygoing weekend trip, just a simple getaway deep in the woods with my friends. We planned everything out: tents, food, flashlights, and extra batteries. We'd chosen a spot by the lake, miles from the nearest road, so we wouldn't see another soul for days. The first day went perfectly, hiking, swimming, laughing by the fire as the sun went down. The isolation made everything feel a little surreal, like we'd stepped into a world of our own. It was after dinner, with night fully settled around us, that Yena suggested we explore the area. She'd always been the adventurous one, pushing us to do things we wouldn't otherwise. We took our flashlights and set off, joking that she was leading us on a ghost hunt. As we walked, the woods thickened, swallowing our voices and muffling our laughter. Shadows danced along the ground, strange in the beams of our flashlights, and the trees grew denser, leaning over us like they were watching. At some point, the trail split off, and Yena darted ahead before anyone could stop her. We tried calling her back, but she laughed and said she'd meet us back at camp in a few minutes. Not wanting to argue, we kept walking, staying on the main path. We turned back after a while, realizing we'd been gone longer than we'd planned, and headed to the campsite. We figured Yena would already be there, probably lying in wait to jump out and scare us, but the campsite was empty when we returned. Her things were still where she'd left them, untouched. The fire was almost out, just a few embers crackling quietly, casting a faint orange glow over the tents. Panic started to creep in, and we called her name, listening to our voices echo into the dark trees. Silence answered us, thick and unnerving. The minutes ticked by, and then the hours. By now, it was close to midnight, and our nerves were stretched thin. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, made us whip around, expecting Yena to jump out. But the silence dragged on. Just as we were about to head into the woods to search for her, we saw a faint light bobbing in the trees. Relief surged through us. Yena was finally back. But as the light grew closer, something was off. The way it swayed wasn't like a flashlight. It moved fluidly, almost like it was floating. We called out to her, but there was no answer. The light kept moving closer, slow and deliberate, weaving through the trees. Then we saw it, a figure in the dark, cloaked in shadows. It wasn't Yena. The figure was too tall, its movements too stiff. Whoever it was held a lantern that flickered with an unnatural glow, a greenish light that seemed to pulse in the darkness. Chains rattled as the figure moved closer, dragging across the ground. Loud and metallic. My heart pounded as we stumbled back, retreating toward the camp. But the figure kept coming, each step slow, unhurried. The light from the lantern cast strange shadows over its face. It wore a mask, pale and featureless, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through us. I grabbed my friends, and we hid behind a nearby fallen tree, peering out as the figure entered our camp. It stopped by Gina's tent, standing still as if listening. The chains clanked softly as it reached down, running its hand over her things, pausing for a moment before moving to the next tent. My breath caught in my throat as it lifted the lantern, casting light over the empty tents, the coolers, the dying fire. Then it leaned down, scratching something into the ground with the tip of a chain, the metal scraping against the earth with a terrible sound. After what felt like hours, the figure turned, vanishing back into the trees, the light from the lantern fading with it. We stayed hidden until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Only then did we dare to creep back to our camp, every step careful, as if that figure might suddenly reappear. On the ground, where the figure had knelt, were 3 words carved deeply into the dirt. "She's with you." Gina's belongings were gone. Her backpack, her sleeping bag, even her shoes were missing. Everything she'd brought had disappeared without a trace, leaving no sign that she'd ever been there at all. Without a word, we packed up, leaving behind whatever we couldn't carry. We didn't stop walking until we reached the car, not even looking back as we sped down the narrow, winding road away from that place. To this day, I can still hear the clanking of those chains in my nightmares. And sometimes, just when I think I've forgotten, I'll catch a faint whiff of that strange greenish light just for a second. None of us ever found out what happened to Yena, but we know one thing for certain. Whoever, or whatever, that figure was, it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip with friends. We chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the sounds of the city. The kind of place where you can hear the rustle of leaves and feel the crunch of twigs beneath your feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The air was filled with the smell of roasting marshmallows and the crackling of burning wood. Jenna suggested we go for a night hike to embrace the wilderness. The others were hesitant, but I felt adventurous. The mushrooms we had consumed earlier made everything feel magical, and I wanted to explore. The darkness felt like an invitation, pulling us into its depths. We grabbed our flashlights, the beams slicing through the night like knives. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around us, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the starry sky. We chatted nervously, but the mood shifted when we heard a sudden rustling. It was louder than any animal we'd encountered, like something large was moving through the underbrush. We froze, exchanging anxious glances. Then we heard a low growl that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a wolf. This was something different, something wrong. Before we could react, Jenna pointed ahead, her flashlight beam flickering over something in the distance. My heart raced as I strained to see what it was. Through the trees, a figure emerged. A man, or at least, he looked like one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as if he had never seen sunlight. He wore ragged clothes that hung loosely from his body, and his hair was wild, matted with leaves and dirt. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the emptiness in his eyes, like he was staring right through us. We instinctively backed away, trying to remain silent. But in our panic, Jenna accidentally stepped on a twig, the sound snapping through the air like a gunshot. The figure jerked his head toward us, and the growl intensified. Fear took hold, and we bolted into the trees, heartbeats racing and breath coming in short gasps. We ran without direction, branches scratching at our arms and legs as we tore through the underbrush. The growl was now a roar, echoing in the night. We could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate. It felt like something was chasing us, hunting us. I glanced back and saw the man was following, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. We finally stumbled upon a clearing, and without thinking, we hid behind a thick bush, our bodies pressed together, trembling. We listened as the footsteps grew closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my voice away. Then silence. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought we had escaped. We remained crouched, hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Just when I thought we were safe, a rustling came from the bush right next to us. I nearly screamed when I turned my flashlight towards it, only to reveal a raccoon, its eyes reflecting the light before it scurried away. But we were not alone. A whisper came from the shadows. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable. As it grew louder, my heart sank. The voice was low and raspy, calling out Jenna's name. The darkness felt alive, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against us. We dared to look out from behind the bush. To our horror, we saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights. He was now closer, his mouth moving as he chanted Jenna's name over and over, each utterance dripping with malice. Just as I thought we were trapped forever, something incredible happened. The figure suddenly stopped, his eyes widened, and he stumbled back, looking terrified. He turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were paralyzed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The chanting stopped, replaced by the sounds of the forest returning to normal. We slowly emerged from our hiding spot, still shaken, but relieved to be alive. As we made our way back to the campsite, we talked about what we had seen. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even in the safety of the campfire. The horror of that night haunted us, but the morning brought a sense of relief. We quickly packed our things and left. Days later, I received a text from Jenna. She had done some research and discovered that the area we camped in was notorious for strange occurrences. Multiple reports of people vanishing had been recorded over the years, always near that same clearing. But what made my blood run cold was the final line of her message. There's something more. They say if you hear your name whispered in the woods, it means they are looking for you. I've been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, and I thought I'd seen it all: storm damage, lost hikers, even some wildlife encounters that had me on edge. But nothing prepared me for that night. It started like any other shift, checking the park's trailheads and ensuring the campsites were properly maintained. The forest here is dense, old, and a bit eerie, but it's nothing I couldn't handle. I had just finished my rounds and was heading back to the station when my radio crackled to life. "Ranger, you there?" It was one of the other rangers, a younger guy named Thomas, who'd been working for less than a year. "Yeah, what's up?" I replied, adjusting the radio. "There's someone out here, just past the old ranger station on the Eastern Trail. I've been calling out, but I think they're ignoring me." I frowned. The area he mentioned was remote, and not many hikers ventured there. It was known for its overgrown paths and decaying structures, not the kind of place anyone would choose to be alone, especially as dusk was settling in. "I'll head over," I said. "Stay put until I get there." I drove my truck down the winding road, the sun barely hanging onto the horizon. The trees were thick, their trunks dark and twisted. As I approached the old ranger station, my headlights caught the faded, weathered sign. I slowed down, scanning the area with my high beams. There was no sign of Thomas. I parked the truck and stepped out, immediately feeling the cool, damp air that carried a strange stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you uncomfortable. I switched on my flashlight and began walking toward the station. I was still calling out for Thomas, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more the silence seemed to press in on me. I made it to the station and found it just as desolate as I remembered: dulled wood, crumbling brick, and broken windows. I shined the flashlight around the area, but saw no sign of anyone. Then, something caught my attention. A footprint, fresh and large, was embedded in the mud just outside the door. I froze. The ground had been soft from recent rain, and the footprint was unmistakable to clear to be from an animal, but too large to be a normal human print. My heartbeat quickened, but I pushed the thought out of my head. I needed to find Thomas. I walked through the station, my boots echoing in the hollow space. The air inside was damp, with a faint, musty smell. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, like something moving in the next room. My hand went to the flashlight, and I flicked the beam toward the noise. Nothing. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I entered the next room, I froze in place. There, sitting in the far corner, was Thomas. He was facing the wall, unmoving, his head down. "Thomas," I called out softly, my voice shaking. I stepped closer, but he didn't respond. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I crouched down next to him, trying to get his attention. That's when I noticed that his skin was pale, to pale, and his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at the floor. But there was something wrong with his eyes. They were completely white, no pupils, just blank. I jerked back, suddenly terrified. Thomas, hey, what the hell is going on? His head slowly turned toward me, but it wasn't Thomas anymore. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, the edges cracking, as though something inside him had torn. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My legs hit a piece of debris on the floor, sending a loud crack through the air. That was when the thing, whatever it was, lunged at me. I barely managed to roll out of the way, my heart slamming in my chest. The thing, it wasn't Thomas. It was something else entirely, mimicking him, using his body like a puppet. I scrambled to my feet, fear surging through me. The flashlight was still in my hand, but it had slipped from my grip, and now the light was weak, flickering. I bolted out of the station, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around me, every branch and tree whispering in the wind. I ran faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins, but as I reached the truck, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, peeling out of the station's lot. My hand shook on the wheel as I raced back to the main ranger station. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisted. There, standing in the road behind me, was Thomas, his blank white eyes staring right at me. The last thing I remember, before I drove away, was seeing that figure disappear into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but the rangers all agreed. Thomas had left the station hours ago, and there was no way he could have made it out there before me. That thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me. My friends and I chose a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from any trails or campsites. The idea was to get lost in nature and enjoy the quiet. We had no idea how quickly the peace would unravel. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink as we unloaded our gear. The trees here were dense, their trunks thick and dark. The sun barely filtered through the leaves. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and built a fire at the center of our camp. As the evening deepened, the air grew colder, and the fire's crackling was the only sound that broke the silence. At first, the forest seemed comforting, isolated, untouched. But as night fell, a strange unease began to settle over me. It wasn't anything specific, just an overwhelming feeling that something was off. I kept pushing it down, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. Then, just as I was about to take a sip of water, I heard something. A soft rustle in the bushes, too deliberate to be an animal. Everyone else was distracted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling persisted. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. A sudden movement in the tree line caught my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. My heart started to race. I forced myself to smile and join the conversation, but I couldn't ignore the growing discomfort gnawing at me. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. The forest was pitch black now, the fire a dying glow in the distance. I crawled into my tent, trying to ignore the eerie silence of the night. I zipped it up, rolled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. There was something out there. I could feel it. Every rustle of the wind in the trees, every crack of a twig seemed too loud, too close. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves. But the longer I lay there, the more restless I became. Then, a sound pierced the night, a soft whisper, just outside my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind, not the trees, it was a voice, faint but distinct. Help ... I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The voice came again, clearer this time. Help me. I reached for the zipper of my tent, my fingers trembling. I had to know who or what was out there. I slowly unzipped the flap and poked my head out, scanning the darkness. The forest was still. No movement, no sounds, just the rustling of leaves. Then, I heard it again, right behind me. Help me. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing, just the empty space inside my tent, the dark forest outside. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to zip the tent back up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I lay still, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, this time louder. Help me, please. This time, it didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a plea, like something trapped. My skin prickled with fear, and I fought the urge to scream. What was happening? Who was calling out for help? I could feel the tension in the air, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. I listened carefully, my pulse hammering in my ears. And that's when I heard something that froze my blood. A voice, deep and rasping, came from just outside my tent. I'm behind you. I didn't move. I couldn't. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear its soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around my tent. The world felt suffocating. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the side of my tent sent me flying out of my sleeping bag, heart racing. I scrambled to turn on my flashlight, but the beam shook so violently I could barely focus it. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice familiar, but wrong. You're not alone. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The forest was still, too still. I turned it off and on again, the beam cutting through the night. That's when I saw it, a figure, a face, pale and distorted, staring at me through the fabric of the tent. I gasped, heart in my throat. It vanished instantly, as if it had never been there at all. I threw the tent open and bolted outside, my friends standing around the fire. I could hardly speak, but when I managed to, all I could say was that we needed to leave. Now, we packed up in a hurry, our hearts pounding in our chests, and we didn't stop until we were miles away. The most terrifying part, when we looked at the photos we had taken earlier in the day. One image stood out. A shot of the trees with the camp in the background. In the upper corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure tall and thin, with hollow, staring eyes. It was the face I had seen in the tent. I never thought I'd be one of those people who would have something to say about a haunting. I've always been skeptical, dismissing strange noises or feelings as the result of stress or overactive imaginations. But that weekend, my beliefs changed forever. My friends and I had rented an old house for a quiet weekend getaway. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place you can only reach by a long, winding road. When we arrived, the house looked just as we expected, charming, old-fashioned, with creaky floors and antique furniture. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. We spent the day exploring the area, taking in the fresh air, and enjoying the solitude. By dusk, we were back inside, sitting around the large fireplace, talking and laughing. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house changed. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air, the fire flickering, and then, the sound started. At first, it was just creaking, a few odd noises from the floorboards above us. I didn't think much of it. Old houses are known for settling. But, as the evening wore on, the noises grew more distinct. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing across the floor above us. I looked at my friends. They were all chatting, oblivious. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I stayed quiet, trying to convince myself that it was just the house. But the footsteps didn't stop. They went on for minutes, circling the room above, like someone was pacing around up there. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up, telling my friends I was going to check upstairs. They laughed it off, assuming it was just the wind or the house settling. But as I made my way up the narrow stairs, my heart pounded harder with every step. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. When I reached the top of the stairs, the house was silent. To silent, I moved down the hallway, checking each room, but there was no one there. No sign of any movement, just the eerie silence of the old house. I thought I was being paranoid, but as I turned to head back to the stairs, I saw it. A door, slightly ajar, at the far end of the hallway. It hadn't been open when I first came upstairs. I froze. The footsteps, the creaking, all made sense now. Something or someone had been up here. My breath hitched as I approached the door. I reached out to push it open, and just as my fingers touched the handle, The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I staggered back, nearly falling down the stairs in shock. I ran downstairs, shaking, and told my friends what happened. They didn't believe me, of course. They joked about it, but something in my gut told me we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the walls made me jump. I stayed awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft knock on my bedroom door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The knock came again, louder this time. I slowly rose from the bed and approached the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a whisper. "Let me in." I froze. The voice was unmistakable, a low, raspy whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill straight through me. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away and huddled in the corner of the room, my heart racing. The knock came again, followed by the whisper, now louder and more insistent. "Let me in." I must have stayed in that corner for hours, too terrified to move, until the sun finally rose. When morning came, I thought it was over. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when I went to check the door, it was ajar, just like the one upstairs the night before. I didn't say anything to my friends. They were still asleep, oblivious to what had happened. But, as we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange. A small, almost unnoticeable handprint on the doorframe, tiny, but clear enough to make my stomach churn. We left that morning, never speaking of what happened. I still don't know what it was, but every time I close my eyes, I hear that whisper in my ear, "Let me in." I never thought I'd be one to experience something unexplainable. My friends and I were always practical, skeptical, but one weekend trip, far out in the woods, changed everything. We rented a small, isolated cabin. The kind you see in movies where people go to get away, only to encounter the supernatural. I figured it would be peaceful, a quiet place to drink, relax, and forget about the world. We arrived at sunset, the cabin surrounded by trees, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the porch. The inside was rustic wooden floors, old furniture. The smell of pine lingered in the air. It felt cozy enough, and we spent the evening unpacking and talking. As night fell, a chill settled in. We gathered around the fire inside, laughing and joking about ghost stories, trying to keep the mood light. But then the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I dismissed it as a typical storm, but my friend Jack seemed unnerved. He kept glancing nervously at the door. "I think something's out there," he muttered, but we all laughed it off. We turned in for the night around midnight. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. The air was unusually cold, but I chalked it up to the old cabin. As I lay in bed, I heard the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, like nails scraping wood. My heart raced. I told myself it was the wind or an animal outside. But then came the sound I couldn't ignore, a tap. Light but distinct, on my door. My blood ran cold. "Hello." I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The wind outside had died down, and all that was left was the eerie silence. I decided to check the hallway. Slowly, I opened my door and crept into the dark corridor. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the house was otherwise still. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated. The downstairs was quiet, but there was a faint light coming from the living room. Someone was downstairs. I didn't want to go down, but I had to. Something felt wrong. I tiptoed down the stairs, every step echoing in the empty cabin. As I rounded the corner into the living room, I froze. The fire had gone out, but the room was lit by someone standing near the window. It was a figure, pale and unmoving, staring out into the night. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then, without warning, it turned to face me. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, a mass of blackness that seemed to absorb the light. No face, just a vague outline. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there, watching me. My heart thudded in my chest. I stepped back, my foot catching the edge of the coffee table. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react, but the air grew colder, the silence heavier. I bolted upstairs and slammed my door shut. The entire night, I lay wide awake, heart racing, listening for any sound, but nothing came. No more knocks, no more scraping, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears. The next morning, I didn't want to mention it to my friends. I figured they'd think I was imagining things. But when we all gathered in the kitchen, I saw that Jack looked as pale as I felt. "I heard something last night," he said, voice trembling. "Someone was knocking at my window, and ... I saw something out there, a figure." My stomach twisted. Everyone shared their experiences, and it was clear none of us had slept well. I suggested we leave early, but no one wanted to drive back through the dark woods just yet. So, we decided to stay for one more night. That evening, we stayed inside. None of us wanted to go outside or even near the windows. We ate dinner in silence, the tension thick in the air. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for us. Around midnight, we heard the knocking. It started faint, then grew louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the walls. Everyone froze. The sound was relentless, rhythmic, like it was searching for a way in. Then, there was a voice, low and hoarse. "Let me in." It was unmistakable. We bolted out of the cabin and into the car, not even bothering to pack our things. As we drove away, I glanced back through the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, dark and silent except for the faint, flickering light from the upstairs window. Months later, I looked up the cabin online. The description said it was recently renovated, but the listing had been taken down. I found a local news article from the 1980s about a family that had gone missing near the cabin. They had been staying in a cabin just like ours, but the article never explained what happened to them. It didn't say they were found. I don't know what was in that cabin with us, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of the knocking on the walls, and the voice that wasn't human. Something was in there, and it had been waiting for us to arrive. We weren't the type to go to haunted places. It wasn't that we didn't believe in ghosts. It was just that none of us wanted to test it out. But when we saw the ad for a weekend getaway at a supposedly haunted house, we thought it would be fun. Just a harmless thrill, a way to break up the monotony. The house was old, much older than we expected. The kind of place where the floorboards creaked under every step and the air smelled faintly of mildew. We arrived late on a Friday evening, the sun already down, and the house seemed to greet us with an eerie silence. The first few hours were fine. We joked about the house's creepy reputation, settled into our rooms, and started a game of cards in the living room. But, as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Around midnight, we heard it. A thudding noise coming from the upstairs. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but the sound grew louder. There was no one else in the house, no one but us. We all paused, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time running down the hallway. I was ready to laugh it off, but something stopped me. It was too deliberate. I suggested we check it out. My friends hesitated, but curiosity got the best of them. We tiptoed up the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. The hallway upstairs was dark, but we could see the door to one of the rooms open a crack, just enough to feel like something was watching us. Then the thud came again, closer this time. It was coming from the open room. We didn't dare move. The noise stopped. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, frozen. And then, a voice, faint and raspy, came from the room. "Leave." The sound sent a chill down my spine. We all backed away, but then the door slammed shut by itself, as if something inside didn't want us near. I don't think any of us slept that night. The air was too thick with unease. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like it was watching us. We could hear whispers from the other rooms, distant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Morning came, but the strange feelings didn't go away. We tried to forget about it, to shrug it off as just a prank or our imagination running wild, but something about that place still unsettled us. After breakfast, we decided to explore the house. We went into the attic, hoping to find something to distract us. The stairs creaked under our feet as we made our way up. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes, but there was something strange about the far corner. A large mirror, covered in dust, stood there, reflecting only the dim light from our flashlights. We wiped the dust off and stared into it. The reflection was odd fuzzy, blurry, like the mirror couldn't quite capture the room right. Then it shifted. For a brief moment, it looked like the room behind us wasn't the attic at all. It was a hallway, with the same door we'd seen earlier, the one that slammed shut. But it wasn't just that. There was something else in the reflection, standing in the hallway. A figure, a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was obscured, but his posture was unnerving, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though he was staring directly at us. I gasped and turned around. There was nothing behind us, just the dusty attic. We all felt it, then a cold wave of dread. The temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers returned, now louder, more urgent. We didn't waste any time. We hurried down the stairs and out of the house, our nerves frayed, but as we were leaving, something caught my eye. It was a small piece of paper tucked under the door. I picked it up, feeling a strange sensation in my fingers as I unfolded it. The message was simple, written in jagged handwriting. "Don't look in the mirror." I nearly dropped it. My hands shook as I showed it to the others. We all stared at each other, too terrified to speak. We didn't stay another minute. We packed up and left, not daring to look back. The drive home was quiet, everyone too shaken to talk. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I froze. For a brief second, I saw the same reflection in the glass, the tall figure, standing behind me, its face still hidden. The figure was in the mirror again. But this time, it wasn't the old house, it was our car, and the figure was standing just inches from my seat. That's when I realized. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It had followed us. Cabin in the woods, just me and a few friends. No distractions, no work, just nature. We had rented the place online, a secluded spot far from civilization. None of us were particularly into ghost stories. So when we arrived and saw how isolated the cabin was, it felt more peaceful than eerie. The cabin itself was charming, if a bit old. The walls creaked in places, but we didn't think much of it. The first night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for me. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind howling outside, and then scratch a faint noise from the other side of the cabin. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe an animal outside, but when the scratching sound continued, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I waited for my friends to make a joke about it. When no one did, I decided to get up and check. I crept down the hallway toward the front door, peering through the window at the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement, just trees swaying under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned to head back to my room. That's when I heard a soft, desperate knock on the door. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in such a remote place? I moved slowly back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I stood there, straining my ears for any sounds. There was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. I finally returned to my room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I locked the door behind me, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, hoping they would laugh it off. But no one did. Instead, Sarah, one of the girls with us, said she heard something too. She described the same scratching sound I'd heard, but from the window. She had thought it was an animal at first, but the knocking she couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to clear our heads. It felt like the cabin was miles away from any other human being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. That night, after dinner, we were all sitting around the fireplace, and the conversation turned toward local legends. Apparently, the area was known for being haunted, or so the locals claimed. One of my friends, Jake, started telling a story about a woman who had gone missing years ago, her last known location being just a few miles from the cabin. He described how people said they could hear her crying at night. I laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare me. Later that night, when we were all in our rooms, I heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratch on the wood. And then, once again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't on the door. It was on my window. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back, heart racing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I closed the curtains quickly, then heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. Let me in. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. I glanced toward the door. Still locked. My room felt suffocating. The knock came again. Bang. Louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hall to the living room, and yanked open the door. Nothing. No one was outside. Just the pitch-black darkness of the woods. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I stood there, staring out into the void. I closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm myself. And then, in the faint light of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was wet. A trail of dark smudges marked the wooden floor, leading from the door to the window of the living room. I followed the trail, every step feeling like it was pulling me into some kind of nightmare. I reached the window. There, smeared against the glass, was a handprint, and it wasn't small. It was too large for a person. I backed away in terror, stumbling toward the door. But when I looked out into the woods again, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance, just outside the boundary of the trees. It was watching us. It was always watching. I slammed the door shut and rushed to wake the others. But when I turned to tell them, they were all standing in the hallway, staring at me in silence. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized the handprint wasn't on the window. It was on the back of my hand, and it was still wet. We packed up and left at once, leaving the cabin behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the distance. And the worst part, I know it followed us. We never should have left. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger, just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, we began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify. but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. "Don't leave." I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later, that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance. It was a quiet evening when we decided to drive out to the old orchard on the edge of town. I had heard stories about it being haunted, but they were just that, stories. I was with a group of friends, all of us looking for a break from the same old routine. The moon was full, casting a pale glow that made the rows of gnarled apple trees look like twisted, skeletal sentinels. As we parked the car and stepped out, the silence swallowed us whole. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just the cold wind cutting through the branches and the sound of our feet crunching over the gravel path. The air was heavy, as if it were holding its breath. We wandered through the orchard, laughing and daring each other to go farther. It was just a bit of fun, a way to make memories. But then we reached the center of the orchard, where the trees were so dense they blocked out most of the moonlight. The ground here was soft and spongy, and something felt off. One of my friends, Mark, bent down to pick up a rock, brushing his hand against the damp earth. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up the rock. It was cracked, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the pale, sinewy root that curled around the rock, creeping like a finger. "Come on, that's just a root," Sarah said, but her voice trembled. The breeze picked up, carrying with it a low, groaning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the orchard. We all looked at each other, uneasy. Suddenly, without warning, the ground beneath our feet shuddered. It was a soft tremor at first, but then it grew, vibrating so violently that I almost fell. In the panic, we shouted for each other to move, but no one wanted to break free of the circle we had formed. That's when I saw it. From between the twisted roots and the base of the trees, something emerged. It was thin, impossibly long, with limbs that bent in the wrong directions. Its skin was ashy gray, and its eyes were black wells that seemed to pull at my sanity. It reached out, claw-like hands stretched to the sky. "Run!" I yelled, and the group scattered, leaving me behind as I stumbled over the rough ground. The trees around us creaked and groaned as if alive, the roots shifting and moving like they were trying to trip us up, to pull us back into the dirt. I was the last to make it to the edge of the orchard, just as I reached the line of trees where the moonlight shone through. I glanced back and saw it standing there, watching me. The thing didn't follow, but its black eyes locked onto mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. It whispered something. The voice was the sound of scraping rock, a word I couldn't make out, but I knew it was speaking my name. I ran without stopping until I hit the road and found my friends, panting and wide-eyed. We didn't look back as we drove away, the engine roaring against the silence behind us. The next day, I returned to the orchard, wanting to prove to myself that it had been an illusion. But when I got there, it was just as it always had been, silent, desolate, a place that seemed forgotten. I noticed, however, that in the soil, where the rock had been picked up the night before, there was a shallow impression of a handprint long, slender fingers etched in the dirt as if someone had pressed against the earth, trying to reach out. I left without saying a word to anyone. That night, as I lay in bed, the same whisper came back to me, this time louder, clearer. It called my name again, from somewhere far in the distance, and I knew it would never stop. A few friends, a remote location, and no distractions, just the way we wanted it. The cabin was a little older than we expected, but it had character. We arrived just before sunset and spent the evening laughing around the fire pit, exchanging old stories. The atmosphere felt peaceful, but as the sun set, a strange quiet settled in, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. I chalked it up to the isolation, but a creeping sense of unease grew as the night wore on. We retired to our rooms after a while. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway, and I felt an odd tension the moment I closed the door behind me. The sounds from the house were creaking. The wind outside were expected, but then I started hearing something else, a tapping. Faint at first, like someone knocking softly on the door, followed by a dragging noise. I froze, heart pounding. I was certain it wasn't the wind. I lay still, trying to listen. Another tap. Then something that sounded like fingernails scraping against the door frame. My skin prickled. I had to get up, but I didn't want to. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling. The noise stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was over. But just as I thought I might be able to sleep, there came a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "Let me in," I nearly screamed. The voice sounded too close, like it was coming from just outside my door. It wasn't a prank. I knew that much. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I sat against the door, every part of me screaming to run. I glanced around the room, searching for something to use as a weapon. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The voice didn't return. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found my friends already downstairs. They were chatting, completely unaware of the events from the night before. I didn't mention it. Who would believe me? Instead, we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to forget the oppressive silence that had followed us all night. Later that evening, we sat around the fireplace again, talking casually, but the nagging feeling returned. The wind outside was picking up again, howling through the trees. As we chatted, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the door frame. I hadn't seen them before, but there they were, deep, jagged gouges like something had been clawing at the door. I tried to shake it off, but as the night went on, the air grew thicker, colder. Then, at exactly midnight, a sudden loud bang shook the cabin. My heart stopped. It sounded like something or someone had struck the door with force. We all froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, stood up slowly. "I'll check it out," he said. We didn't stop him. It was stupid, but in the moment, we were all too frozen to act. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and looked around. There was nothing there, no one, just an empty corridor. He turned to look back at us, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said quietly, confused. We all moved into the hallway to see what he was talking about. The door frame was covered in fresh, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the door was a handprint. It was smeared in something dark, something that didn't belong. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't paint. It looked like blood. None of us said anything at first. The air felt heavy. I glanced down the hallway, my blood running cold. The door to the attic, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Without thinking, I moved towards it, my steps slow and hesitant. We had to know what was happening. The others followed me, but no one spoke. As I approached the attic stairs, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of someone breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, from inside the attic. I turned to the others. and Mark motioned for us to stay quiet. He approached the stairs and slowly reached for the light switch. The attic light flickered on. We waited, breath held, as the shadows parted to reveal an empty room, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a full-length mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. Standing behind us, reflected in the glass, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. A pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, but no one else saw her. In the room. Just in the mirror. Suddenly, the house seemed to shudder as if it had come alive. The mirror cracked, and then everything went black. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, hearts still pounding, and we never spoke of that night again.